The Rune Smith. Chapter 71. Descending into the dungeon. Town of Audiobook it was called. It was a mostly unexplored settlement away from large cities on Dragness Island. The people that lived here were a peaceful bunch that liked to live their lives slowly. Most of them were farmers, hunters, and fishermen that earned their living through their craft. It didn't seem like the monotone life that they spent here would be changing anytime soon. This changed on one faithful day. The ground shook on a certain stormy night. Everyone woke up thinking that some kind of monster had finally attacked. People had heard the rumors of dragons living on this island in the innermost parts. Maybe one of them had decided to pay them a visit? The truth was slightly different. It did involve monsters, but the citizens weren't in any danger. After the storm cleared up and the sun shone on the mountains, they could finally see it. A large volcano had sprung out from the ground. Smoke was coming out of it, clearly active and dangerous. Only a small number of guards and hunters lived here. A scouting party was quickly formed, and in a few days, they brought the news of the new discovery. The new volcano had an entrance. It wasn't a natural cave, no, it was quite different. It had an uncharacteristic gate design with embedded patterns. It looked man-made, but the people living there clearly knew such a thing was impossible. There was nothing there just a day ago. This was clearly an entrance to a dungeon. The people in this country or even the whole world weren't sure about how dungeons came to be. There were various types of them around, some even had their own ecosystems. Others looked like ancient ruins with catacombs spreading below the earth. This one was similar to the latter but also different in many ways. With this news, their life got turned upside down. Their peaceful little town would soon be overrun with adventurers. The old farmers despaired, but some of the more crafty ones knew that this was their chance. The person who took the initiative now could become rich. The adventurers brought a lot of problems with them, but they also brought lots of gold coins. Half a year later, the people that took it upon themselves to invest were now taking in the profits. The inns and pubs were filled to the brim with new people. New shops were popping up to accommodate the new demand. The new unrated dungeon brought all of this in, and this was just the tip of the iceberg. Everyone knew that only after the dungeon was giving a rating its true potential would be discovered. Things like this took some time, as even powerful adventurers weren't willing to venture into it blindly. It was believed that this dungeon was an extension of the main Dragness dungeon that was a super volcano in the middle of this island. The biggest concern with it was the connection. It could be connected anywhere, to another smaller dungeon far away from here, or even directly into the dragon's lair. This was highly unlikely, but it was possible to meet monsters above Tier 3 in random places if this dungeon connected to the main one. Mapping out a dungeon could take even years depending on how large it was. Some of the beginner-friendly levels were already mapped out by the more experienced adventurers. The Adventurer Guild even made money by selling some of the maps. Not all decided on a purchase like that, which could prove fatal in the long run. A certain person in an uncoordinated armor was walking towards this Audiobook dungeon. He was holding onto a map and slowly reading it while finishing up an apple that he bought on his way here. It looks like this dungeon is a labyrinth type, those are tricky ones. This was Roland, wearing his brigandine armor along with his helmet to cover his face. He had his arming sword strapped to his side and a shield that he bought strapped to his back. He looked like a regular warrior. With his height over 185 centimeters, he could easily pass for one. He had made a decision of training up his close quarters fighting skills. The sword-related skills that he had were the most advanced from the combat ones he had. A decision was made by him to focus on it. The shield would also be used for protection, and not only that, as he had tweaked it a bit with his rune crafting skill. Roland didn't abandon his spell casting just yet. He had two smaller wands strapped to his side as another means of attack. He wanted to increase his all-around fighting capability. He could go about it in a couple of ways. First, he could focus on crafting better runic equipment. With various defensive and buffing runes, he would be well protected. His biggest weakness at the moment was a close-range exchange. It was very easy for him to even kill Tier 2 monsters with his common grade spells. That is, if they allowed themselves to be hit. He had won most of his old fights by ranged surprise attacks. There weren't really any moments where he had to face a monster on his level in a true one-on-one battle. Either he hid and used his spells from a safe distance, or he had other people distracting the monsters for him to land a critical blow from afar. I need to develop some kind of fighting style. While walking towards the dungeon, he looked up while thinking. His close-range tactic came down to evading any attacks and then using a fire arrow spell with his wands. There was no fancy footwork involved, any blocking or parrying. It was just pure magical power that was possible through his runic weapons and his high mana pool. If I meet a monster that either dodges or resists one of these spells from close range, I might die. As he was thinking about some fighting combinations, he finally reached his destination. The volcano was giving off puffs of black smoke here and there. The temperature increased slightly the closer he got to this volcano, but it was bearable. He had also attached a special chilling rune to his own armor. If things got too hot, he could lessen the burden on his body by activating it. This rune worked similar to a buffing rune and lowered his mana pool by a set number while being active. Roland moved forward. Other adventurers were also here. Some were waiting for their teammates outside the entrance, some were going in, others were moving out. He could even see scratches and wounds on some of the rough-looking men. They were clearly in a fight not so long ago, and now he would soon be in one as well. This wasn't anything out of the ordinary, he had already been in a dungeon before. There was a slight difference, not from the adventurer's side though. Quite innovative. What he saw was a large wagon on the side. The peculiar thing about this wagon was that it looked more like a food stand. This cart was fully made out of wood and it had a tarp hoisted out from the side. There was also a window to which you could move over and peek in. Get your healing potions and mana potions here, we also have pure water for your parched throat. There was a young girl with a twin bun hairstyle shouting out. She looked rather young, about the age of 12 or close to it. She was clearly there to bring attention to this cart, and it was an older man selling some wares. Some of the injured adventurers were even buying up those healing potions. Roland wasn't interested, but he took some time to examine the prices that were out on a large wooden board on the side. Those prices are at least 25% above the regular market value. It looked like this store was ripping people off, but it did offer a new type of service. If you took into account that it was right outside the dungeon area, the 25% rise in price could be stomached. I hope they know what they are doing though. Roland walked on while looking at some of the adventurers here. They were focusing on that cart with the healing and mana potions. Their faces had a certain attribute to them which didn't bode anything good for the future. He wouldn't get involved in something like this though, he needed to look out for himself instead. He placed himself in front of the large dungeon opening. It really did look like a giant gate, it was at least 5 meters tall. It didn't have a door on it, but there were columns to the side that continued upwards and connected in a half-circular pattern to each other. Right at the area where they came together was a sculpture of a skull, its eyes flaming with a magic flame. Roland almost instantly activated his debugging skill to scan this gate, but he came out empty. There weren't any runes on it of any kind. He could see some strange writings which could be regular enchantments instead. There were other ways than runes to make objects magical in nature, and spell enchantments were one of them. Before people could start staring, he moved forward into the corridor. After passing this gate, he was greeted by a slight draft. There were stairs leading down into the dark dungeon, torches were on the side, and the whole place was quite well lit. He continued forward without stopping while also scanning the walls for any runes. The walk down continued, and the further he got, the more wind he could feel blowing onto his helmet. When he finally got down the stairs, he found himself in a large area. The walls looked like they were made from large stone bricks, and there were torches here and there. Which one to take? There were other people here with him, walking into some of the corridors. This area was like a large hub with tunnels. It was the beginning section of this dungeon labyrinth and was considered a safe zone. The monsters that were in those corridors wouldn't be able to come in here, as some unseen force was keeping them back. The experts weren't sure why this was the case. The monster bodies could be carried out of the dungeon and processed. The mana stones that they had didn't just vanish when they got out of the dungeon's domain either. But somehow there was a limit on how far these monsters could venture out. Roland read that some people did some tests with weaker monsters. They captured one goblin and tried bringing him outside. There was a strange discovery made then. It was as if some kind of invisible barrier was keeping the monster inside. Even when the researchers tried pushing the monster past the dungeon area, it wouldn't budge. It even got squished to death after they used too much force. They could only come to the conclusion that there was some higher tier magic involved. They theorized that the dungeon could be in a different spatial space. To the monster, there was nothing past the dungeon entrance. The world outside might be on a different frequency or even in a different dimension. The adventurers inside could somehow move freely between these spaces, but the monsters could only do it after they died. The dungeon would also reabsorb any corpses of the monsters that died inside if they weren't taken. The same would happen to any dead adventurer. This was also why no one ever found old bodies in these lairs. Where should I go? Roland looked at the map that he bought. This floor of the dungeon's labyrinth was already mapped out, and he even drew a line towards the next floor. This didn't mean that everything had been looted already. This dungeon type brought one large bonus with itself compared to the open forest one he previously was in. Periodically a chest with loot would appear. Where they came from no one knew. It was as if the dungeon itself was trying to entice the adventurers to do more exploring. The higher the danger level of the monsters, the better loot you would find. Bosses would also drop certain items and respawn at a set time, just like in games. Well, I'm here to train for now. I'll just pick a path with the least traps around. The biggest reason for getting this map was to know where the traps were. If a person wasn't careful in this type of dungeon, they would meet their demise quite fast. Labyrinth and ruin type of dungeons that looked man-made always had traps in them. Without a scout or a thief in your party, it was very dangerous. Roland did have a life signal detection device, but he didn't have anything for those traps. With the map in his hand, he would be able to evade his untimely demise. He finally looked to one of the corridors, which he then picked as the one to use. The passage was quite huge. It had a similar flaming skull above the entrance. The inside was another corridor with some torches on the side that gave the minimal amount of light for people to see. Roland was a bit surprised about the insides of this dungeon. If he didn't know any better, he wouldn't think that it was located inside a volcano. From the information that he gathered, apparently the further down a person went, the more the heat increased. There was even a mining section after you made it past this labyrinth. He continued further, and finally, the first monster of this dungeon appeared. It was a common type of being that looked like a deflated basketball. Its body was semi-transparent, and inside of it was a round object that was of red coloring. Roland pulled out his arming sword and shield while looking at the small creature. Slimes like this existed in vast quantities around here and in other dungeons. They were one of the weakest monsters around, but even then you had to be careful. They multiplied quite fast and could overrun a newbie adventurer party if they weren't careful. He didn't hide his presence as he approached his first monster. It was quite slow in its approach. The transparent ball-like body stretched out slightly towards his direction as the creature moved. It looked a bit like a small worm, but a rounder one. Roland knew that he could one-shot this thing with the simplest attacking spell that he had. This wasn't the purpose of his training though. He wanted to level up his reflexes, dodging, blocking, and even swordsmanship leveled up faster during real fights. It was unknown why, but during actual combat the skills gained some kind of boost. Increasing them like this was many times faster than regular training. When the fire slime got in range, it started compressing itself. It showed off its iconic attack of spitting some kind of heated liquid towards him. The pressure propelled this spit forward and made it look like some kind of ball of fire. He simply dodged it to the side. The creature was really slow and the attack was easy to read. The moment this heated liquid collided with the wall to his side, it also started to sizzle. If he got hit in the face with something like that, it would probably melt right through his skin. Even a simple monster like this could prove deadly if it got someone by surprise. After dodging to the side, the slime remained unmoving. This was the right time to strike. He gathered some magical energies on his sword while charging forward. The monster was far too slow on the uptake and could only wait for its demise. He sliced with his mana-imbued sword right through the monster. The slime died instantly after one hit. The slimy body that it had quickly dissipated into liquid, and the slime core in the middle dropped down to the floor with a little clanking sound. Normally, to defeat this type of monster, a person would need to destroy its core. Regular physical attacks were ineffective against the gelatinous body of the slime. There was a way around this problem, and it was quite simple. A person just needed to use a spell or a mana-infused weapon, just like Roland did. There was one reason that he used mana instead of going for the core. This slime core was something that he could sell. If he destroyed it, he wouldn't get much for it. This item had similar properties to mana stones, but it could also be used for various other things. Some slimes even had metallic cores that could be turned into weapons with high magic affinity. Well, that's one down now for the rest. Roland glanced into the distance. There he saw many other fire slimes rolling his way. He wouldn't be getting much experience from them, but they were perfect for exercising before he went down to the more difficult levels. It was finally time to become a full-fledged adventurer. Chapter 72, Dungeon First Floor. Gruug. A loud shriek of something non-human was heard, followed by something similar to rattling bones. There was a strange screeching sound of metal against hard stone, along with peculiar-sounding footsteps. This was inside the Audiobook dungeon that hasn't been raided quite yet. Dungeons in this country would be raided after an extensive investigation. The harder it would be to finish, the higher the rating would become. Most of these dungeons also were given nicknames. The super dungeon in the middle of the island had its own. It was called the Infernal Dragon Dungeon. The dragon that lived there had yet to be beaten. A certain youth in an uncoordinated brigandine armor was standing there, shield and sword in hand. He was looking at a new type of monster that he had never seen before, but he had read about in books. It looked like a common skeleton that you would find in many other similar dungeons. There was a small difference though. This one here was literally on fire. This flaming skeleton here was dragging a large sword with one hand and moving towards Roland very slowly. He knew that taking care of this monster would be an easy feat, but he wasn't here to do that. It was the time to train his battle-related skills instead of his magic this time around. He waited patiently without doing any hasty moves. The monster dragged its body toward him slowly, and when it was in range it gave out a loud shriek. How the creature could scream without any vocal cords was what he started asking himself. The large overswing finally came as the skeleton tried hitting him with that sword. He moved behind his shield and took the hit straight on. Normally this would be the time where he used his own sword to slice the monster's head off. Roland didn't do that yet though. He just backed off slightly while looking at his left hand. The attack wasn't that heavy. I can probably grind with this guy a bit. Some skills like shield proficiency and swordsmanship could be trained past the basic variant of the skills by some classes. This was true for most regular combat classes. Even an archer could do this. But a non-combat class like a villager wouldn't be able to do that. So the grinding initiative that he thought of had started. One of the easiest skills would be the one concerning shields and armor. By just blocking with this piece of steel he could level it up. It was even easier with the armor proficiencies, as a person only needed to move around in combat to level it up. If you took hits while wearing heavy armor it would go up even faster, but was a lot more dangerous. The tactic was simple, fighting slow enemies that were easy to read. This skeleton was one of them. His attacking pattern was pretty simple. It would only charge at him blindly while swinging its long sword. The creature's strength was quite low, as it had trouble holding its weapon steady. Blocking it with a shield was a simple task. So the little dance continued until the skeleton's inferior weapon couldn't take it much longer. With one last swing against Roland's shield, the rusty sword snapped in half and flew against the wall. This was also the time that he decided to end the training session. Roland listened to the voice that proclaimed how much experience he had earned. He was already used to how meager the gain was, but it was still disheartening. I could probably get more experience by quickly making iron nails at this point. The monster crumbled into a pile of bones after having its head chopped off with one swing. The fire on its remains continued to burn for a few moments before leaving mostly dust behind. As a little bonus, a small mana stone was retrieved from one of the eye sockets. Can I sell this bone dust for something? Roland rubbed his chin while looking at the pile of half-singed remains. He wasn't sure, but an alchemist might be able to mix this with something. It was a magic skeleton that could resist fire while moving around, so maybe this could be used for a fire resistance potion. More money was always better, so he placed what he could into a large jar that then was pocketed into a spatial bag. After he was finished here, he was planning to visit the city. The market there was booming. This was his first day on the job, so it would be better to take whatever he could. He had many spatial bags with himself, so he probably had a leg up against the competition. Most bronze adventurers lacked the funds for a bag like this, and steel-graded ones probably only had one. The bags he had weren't bottomless. He would probably fill them up quite fast if he started gathering the larger creature corpses. Roland grabbed what he could get and then examined his shield. He could see that the skeleton had scratched up his kite shield, but it was still in working order. This particular one was in the shape of a teardrop. When he held it up to his chin, it reached below his knees and was able to cover most of his body with its width. It also had some mana stones imbued to its structure. He placed them on the inside right next to the shield's enarmes. This enarmes was composed of leather gripping straps attached to the back of the shield. It was held in place by riveting through the leather and the facing of the shield. On the other side, a person could see the spots that it was riveted through. It wasn't perfect and looked a bit yankai, but it worked well enough to get him by here. There was a limit to how many mana stones a shield like this could hold. He couldn't just plaster the backside with 10 of them to mitigate all of the mana requirements. The runic structure wouldn't be able to handle the purified mana and would just deteriorate the whole spell structure instantly. Something akin to a short circuit would happen, which would destroy the whole rune. He had chosen the lesser stones for this shield as he wasn't willing to test the common graded ones on it. The limit on this steel shield was 3 stones, with them around the mana cost went down dramatically. Each stone lowered the mana requirements by close to 20%. That counted for only spells at the same level though. He had placed a regular mana shield runic spell on it. With the stones and his passive skills, the cost was lowered by close to 70% of its original. For him, with a high mana pool, this meant that he could spam this skill quite often and not fear running dry on mana. This wasn't the only spell that was on this shield. He had gotten the hang of multi-structural runic compositions a bit now. He had also gone with a lesser fire resistance buffing spell. This spell would take a flat number of mana points away from him for it to work. This would produce a constant effect. With the lowered mana costs, it was quite manageable and a must for the dungeon filled with fire-type monsters. He had already done some extensive testing against the weaker monsters. The slime's heated spit was useless against this shield. He didn't even feel it heating up after taking a direct hit. It was also the highest possible spell structure, which would make any fire attacks below tier 2 highly ineffective. He didn't have time to work on all of his gear yet. His house renovation was taking up a lot of time and he still lacked a forge. The plan was to train in the dungeon while waiting a month for the construction workers to arrive. Most of them were busy working on the various new stores that were being built by some rich merchants or business owners. The city was constantly progressing, but he had already made an appointment. Roland gripped his shield while placing his sword back into the sheath. He then pulled out the map of this dungeon's level. This was still the first level and he was finished with examining it. It took him a few hours to go through the tunnels without rushing, but it was time to move on. The skeletons were the strongest enemy on this level and capped out at the 10th level. Besides them and the slimes, there were also lizard-looking monsters called baby salamanders. That last one was rumored to evolve into more ferocious monsters like fire drakes and fire wyverns if they gained enough levels. The biggest problem with this level was the sheer number of other adventurers. He met them along the way quite often, which slowed down his progress. When they were fighting, he needed to wait for them to be done before progressing. He could be accused of kill stealing if he tried forcing his way through. Roland wished to evade conflict with others, at least for now. After getting a silver grade card, he could start throwing his weight around a bit. With higher levels, prestige wasn't far behind. If I beeline for the second level from the entrance, I could probably get there in 15 minutes. This level wasn't that large. If a person knew the way, they could stroll past most dangers and descend to the second level quite fast. The lower levels would have less competition and more space to move. The size of the labyrinth increased with the lower levels. There was also supposed to be a boss room somewhere. After passing it, you would arrive at a different area than the labyrinth, or so the intel said. Should I go down, or head home? Roland looked at his remaining mana and stamina. Due to sticking to close quarters combat, he didn't really waste any of his magic points. He did spend a lot of time here, mostly by using his shield to deflect the monster attacks. He could easily kill the creatures here with one swing of the sword. Using his spells on the other hand would be overkill. In the end, he decided to head home. It was close to sundown and he didn't want to trek back while it was dark. He could still scribe more spells back home and repair his runic gear. This would also increase his experience pool and help him level up faster. After using the map to guide himself, he was outside after about 15 minutes. Other adventurers were also going home and not many were going in. There weren't that many facilities in this city, so remaining here during the night would be dangerous. Sleeping or camping inside the dungeon was also ill-advised. There were expeditions that took precautions when venturing inside. Some gold and silver adventurers were already down in the lower levels mapping everything out at this very moment. A large group, sometimes part of a larger organization, would take on such a task. They would bring non-combatants inside that could cook and disassemble monsters. Some were used as packing mules, as even with the spatial technology, space would run out with long expeditions. People like that would be called packing mules. They were easily identifiable by the large backpacks that they were wearing. Those were specialized spatial devices with increased capacity and weight management. This job didn't pay much, but such a person wasn't required to fight. Roland was a solo adventurer, so he didn't really have much use for a packing mule like that. He could just dump everything back at the guild for processing. The monsters he was fighting at the moment were small, so he could manage. Protecting such a person in a one-man party would prove difficult. The red sun rays greeted him after he ascended the long flight of stairs outside of the dungeon. The people that were selling potions were still there, and the young girl was still trying to entice buyers. With time, more merchants would probably set up camp here. Maybe some large stores and even a hotel could be placed in close proximity. Can't have a store too close though. The dungeon might go through an expansion sooner or later. Some dungeons went through things like expansions which increased their size. Such a phenomenon could change the landscape that such a dungeon was on. This volcano could start getting larger and push itself more in a given direction. The possibility of that happening was low. Mostly the dungeons expanded below ground, but you had to take things like that into account. Having a smaller store in a wagon was probably the smarter option at the moment. He left the dungeon along with some other adventurers that were probably also going back to their homes. He remained between some groups as it was unavoidable with so many people around. Roland took some time to look at the parties that were here and spotted a common trait that most of them had. Most of them don't look over 20. This did make sense to him. Youths would be more prone to adventure out into other lands, while seasoned adventurers probably already had things figured out for themselves. It was a big gamble to go to another city that was far away if you already had a good thing going for yourself. The veterans also knew the dangers of going into unmapped dungeons. The first ones there had the opportunity to gain some rare loot, but also to get killed by a trap or unique monster. The grinding spots should clear out the further down I go. Most of these people are bronze or steel grade. He thought that maybe going down to an area that monsters were around the 40th level would be the best choice. Facing ones over 50 would be manageable with his spells, but he wasn't really a true tier 2 class holder yet. With time he arrived back at his brand spanking new home. The door wasn't even squeaking that much as he did replace the hinges. That didn't keep it from scratching the wooden floor that he had fixed, as the door was a tight fit. No one had decided to pay him a visit back here for now. He was in the middle of setting up a wooden fence around his land. If he had the time and manpower, he would place large 3-meter-tall walls to keep everyone out, along with barbed wire to make it hard for people to climb over it. This would be a project for the future, as he still needed the construction company to get over here. Roland was still in possession of some gold coins that he earned back at Edelgard. He received a large sum from Marlowe, his old boss. Besides that, he had his own gold saved up from years of scribing scrolls and enchanting runic equipment. He should be able to get the place renovated with what he had. Resources like wood or stone weren't that costly, so setting up the wall and some defenses wasn't a pipe dream. The wall would be placed more as a deterrent than a defensive measure. He just wanted people to see that they weren't that welcome inside. If someone decided to climb over the barbed wire walls, then the gloves would come off. The first line of defenses would be the usual trap mines, but he was planning to include some other things. There were other spells that he could use. Ones that didn't cause widespread damage to his own property. Wish this game system came with a target-seeking defensive turrets. I'll probably have to design those myself. Wonder if that will ever be possible. Roland had something similar in mind that utilized a specialized spell that could also be triggered. The only problem was with the scroll format. He didn't really want to have to replace the trap scrolls each time someone invaded his privacy. Making some kind of mana generator that included the mana stones was something he was very interested in. He had the knowledge of runes and ethereal pathways that worked similar to wireless technology in his old world. If he managed to create something to generate a source of mana that was constant, he could wire up his whole house. With this, he would be able to make mana-powered utensils that he wouldn't need to power directly himself. For now, he knew how to include mana stones into the runic structures. Those still required a small jolt of his mana to activate, even though the drain was lessened dramatically. I guess I could look through the auction house, but finding something there as a reference will probably be hard. He tried to recall anything that could be of use to him. Something like the engine from that magical train came to mind, but there wasn't anything like that here. He would need to check the town for any magical devices that could work by themselves. But for now, it was time to wind down. He had spent the whole day in the labyrinth. His research would have to wait for another day. Getting some hot water into his tub was the more important thing to do now. Chapter 73 Slow New Start. Clink. Clang. The sound of a metal hammer against metal was heard. It echoed throughout this closed room while the magical sparks illuminated it. Roland, that didn't seem to have grown into his body, was hammering away on a shield. Each time he delivered a blow with his hammer, a strange runic pattern appeared on this tear-shaped piece of metal. This process of hammering continued for a few minutes before the youth had enough. The shield that he was working on was examined before being put away to the side to lean against one of the cellar walls. I really need a furnace. Roland looked around his workshop. It didn't have much. He had a tool rack hanging on the wall along with a thick wooden crafting table. He also possessed his old anvil that was in the middle of it all, but he was lacking a few key elements of this workshop. He was missing a forge, without which he couldn't really do much. There was also room for a smelter, but that was a bit less important than the forge. Without a proper forge, he couldn't heat up the metal. Without softening the metal, shaping it was difficult. His strength did increase, but bending steel and iron into shape was above his abilities. Also, doing such things to unhardened steel wasn't such a smart idea. Roland had some leftover gear from the bandits and from some older creations. With how the rune structures burned through the steel, he wouldn't have much left after prolonged use. Even now, his steel arming sword was already eroding. Swords like this weren't that thick. With prolonged rune usage, the internal structure could crumble. This could lead the blade to snap eventually. It could prove deadly in the midst of battle. While thinking about the future failure of his sword, he looked at the mace he received from his bandit encounter. This item was made from deep iron, which was better than hardened steel. Be it durability, hardness, and the most important, mana resistance. There was quite a difference between this metal and regular iron. While regular iron could sustain a couple of charges of his magical runes, deep iron could manage at least 10 times that amount. Repairing it also removed less material, which would let the weapon survive for longer. He looked at the mace and gave it a couple of practice swings. He could see some cracks here and there in this iron mace. This was all thanks to his runic blacksmith's eyes that let him see all impurities and blemishes of this weapon. The way it was made was also quite crude, which was also why it was ranked low. Even he, with only a few years of blacksmithing under his belt, would be able to make an intermediate version of this weapon if he had the right materials. Though it wasn't really the fault of the craftsman that made this weapon, it was just old and overused. It was normal for weapons and armor to drop in rating when identified after some time. Only masterwork items made from the most resistant metals could last for generations without degrading. I could probably wedge a stone into the handle and give it an impact rune. The durability is only at 64%, but it shouldn't break until it goes below 30%, I hope. The impact rune was one of the first runes that he came across. He could place a common version on this item and not worry about the metal deteriorating too fast. This magic rune worked by increasing the weight of the item it was inscribed on. When swinging this mace, he could make it several times heavier. Force was just the multiplication of acceleration and mass. He was only increasing the mass in this equation to deliver devastating blows. This rune was strong but hard to work with. Activating it too soon or too late would just mess up a person's momentum. Better to also place a hardening rune on it. It will cost more mana, but it won't break that easily. He continued talking aloud. A hardening rune that was sometimes also called the strengthening rune made items more resistant to physical attacks. It worked by coating the weapon in a thin layer of mana that helped in absorbing physical shocks. It was an active type of rune, so placing it on armor would drain the user of their mana quite fast. Roland had already fiddled around with the deep iron metal. He had the 3 slave collars to the side and already knew that inscribing on them would be troublesome. Without softening the metal with some magical fire, this metal was hard to work with. He would be able to manage it somehow on unsoftened resources, but it would significantly increase the crafting time. He didn't really have any other options at the moment. He could try making his own forge, but he wasn't really good at building those. He also didn't swipe the old bellows from his old workshop as he was in a rush and also lacked space. Roland could also attempt to make a new version of the forge that utilized his magical runes. He could replace the bellows with a wind rune. The forge itself didn't need to have some kind of special design, it only needed to spit fire. The more condensed the better. The problem as always were the materials. For a magical forge he would need a lot of deep steel or iron. One from regular metals wouldn't last him long. He also needed something to fuel this forge. Rune crafting while also inserting mana into the forge would strain his mana reserves even if they were abundant for his level. I better get to work then. He decided to work on the mace first. The mana stone would be attached in a crude way for the time being. There would be a lot of hammering and bending involved, but without any alchemical glue, he could only wedge it in by force. He did this by forcing a small opening at the base of the handle with one of his hardy tools. The opening was slightly larger than the mana stone in question. He then gently hammered the opening shut while trying not to damage the hilt along with the stone. Following this, a lengthy process of runesmithing took place. The unsoftened deep iron proved to be quite hard to work with. This forced him to run out of mana several times before he was done with the runic structure. In the end, he had a half-baked weapon with a dual runic structure. Both of those runes were common runes. They were hard to perfect even for him who had spent years training his craft. The difficulty was also increased by the fact that this weapon was made off deep iron. This all without the forge, which made the whole process tedious. He was more familiar with the impact runes, so it came out better. The materials he was working with were also hard to work with, so it would take him some time to perfect everything even with the available highest quality schematics. This will do. He took the mace into his hand and gently inserted mana into the runes. The moment the impact rune was activated, he could feel the weapon getting heavier. The more mana he infused, the more his arm started to shake from the added weight. The other rune was also activating along with the impact one. He had set it up so that the two operated together. Roland looked at the heavy mace that was glowing in a faint blue light. It was given a poke with his hammer to test the hardening rune. It did indeed absorb some of the shocks. The gentle taps were fully defended against. He could see the shield struggling only after he smacked it harder. The new weapon would be more of a backup against stronger monsters. First, he wanted to train his swordsmanship skill to its fullest potential. It was the one that he was most experienced with. Skipping over to blunt weapons at this point could impede his progress. He wanted to at least max one of his weapon skills to the 9th level before trying his class change. It could aid him in getting a new battle class. Getting more than one up would be nice, but he would probably reach the level limit before his skill limit in that situation. Getting a tier 2 class and profiting from the added stat bonus was something that he wanted to get as fast as possible. In this world of unknown dangers, strength was paramount, and he was now very aware of that. Roland dropped the mace to the ground after inserting too much mana into it. It had taken him 2 days to create this item, and he was now quite hungry. He had gone through some old rations, but he was now in the mood for a cooked meal. His kitchen didn't have a stove yet, but he could probably craft himself a runic pan to fry things on it. He just lacked the oil to use it as a deep fryer. It was time to go into the growing city. He had been here for a week now and had gotten the house in a condition that he could live in it. The hinges on the doors were replaced, but the windows were still nailed shut. Luckily for him, this was an island with a warm climate. The nights were slightly chilly, but with a blanket, the windy house didn't bother him that much. The workers that would be coming in a few weeks would need to fix some things. The rat-infested attic was riddled with holes, but he had cleaned it with some pressurized water. Some of the wooden floors would need replacing, but that was a problem for the future. I should head out. He grabbed his clothes from the side. He would be going lighter this time around. He didn't expect any trouble while in town. Roland moved his hands to his helmet and looked at it. Do I really need this? The steel helmet wasn't that comfortable, but it did aid him in gaining experience in heavy armor proficiency. This wasn't the dungeon though, and he would only be going to the city. Did he really need to hide his face? It had been some time since the events in Edelgard. Did that strange cultist lady and the warlock really take a good look at him? He also remembered that she stabbed him through the shoulder with some kind of cursed blade. If he didn't down his potions while going down the stairs, he would be dead from the poison. Then there was the curse that he was lucky enough to have enough money to cure. The cult might think that he was already dead. Not like they would be stupid enough to go right back into Edelgard after that night to check. Without that spire relic that produced the illusion, they wouldn't be able to have the element of surprise. They might have been more concerned with the 2 tier 3 dark elves that were their match. Both of them were healthy the last time he saw them. Roland could only think of one way that they could find him here, and it was by ways of magic. His trail was cold by now. No lower level trackers would be able to follow him, plus they would need a personal possession to start. That dagger did draw his blood, so there could be some occult magic that could home in on his location. But he wasn't sure that long-range tracking magic like that would be pinpoint accurate. Maybe they would get a general location, maybe only pointing to this island and not even the town he was in. Roland was tired of looking over his shoulder. It wasn't a healthy way of living. It was time to give it a rest and move on with his life. He would tackle that trouble when it came. After deliberating for a moment, he decided to not put his helmet on and go with some regular-looking clothes. He wouldn't be able to hide that he lived here anyway. Roland was planning to place one forge closer to the log cabin. He was going to act as a regular blacksmith, which meant that he couldn't hide his face forever. At least not in town. While out adventuring, he would keep the helmet for added protection. He finally left his house after locking up. The way to the real workshop down below was hidden behind an illusion spell. Only people tier 2 and above with high detection skills would be able to see through the spell. There were also some detection spells that worked, but not like anyone had reasons to believe that there was treasure in this house to bother with something like that. After a long walk to town, he was there again. It looked busy as always, and he could even see another caravan arriving just like the one he was part of. There were more young adventurers amongst them, hope for riches and fame clearly visible in their eyes. There were many people coming in and going. He had already seen some of the youngsters getting injured. Not everyone had extensive battle training against monsters when they were young as he did, thanks to his noble upbringing. Most people thought that weak monsters like goblins or those slimes didn't pose much of a threat. They were dumb, slow, and weak, but their attacks hurt like hell when they landed. Roland already witnessed some people getting burn marks from the slime lava-like spit or the fire skeletons. One-on-one they weren't much of a problem, but there were certain areas in the labyrinth where a group of them could lurk. The slimes sometimes stuck to the ceiling and tried to land on a person's head. To the inexperienced thrill seekers, even a little monster like that could prove deadly. He could kind of tell which ones of these would not be having a good time in the coming days here. He himself was taking a slow approach to the dungeon and slowly fighting the unfamiliar monsters to see how they acted. Only after getting accustomed to their attack patterns would he move on to the lower levels. Just like with the other dungeon that he was in, the difficulty steadily increased. The lower levels started getting bigger and more monsters in larger groups appeared. There was also a possibility of an irregular monster that was stronger than the rest showing up. A person had to be careful. He had enough maturity to see this fact, but the regular youngsters had their heads in the clouds. They probably just wanted to get their treasures and hit it off. Most of them were poor, daughters and sons of farmers or fallen nobles trying to reclaim some of that lost honor. Taking the fast route was hard and there were many bumps along the way. Roland had also learned that during his travels. This place doesn't look that packed. While walking, he finally arrived at one of the town restaurants. This one was named the Happy Rooster, and like its name, it mostly served poultry-related dishes. He would love it if there were something like a chicken nugget in this world. He would have to settle for unseasoned chicken breasts or legs instead. The seasoning was mostly something rich merchants or nobles could only afford. Restaurants that were serving to commoners didn't even bother with stocking anything besides sugar, pepper, and salt. Even that heightened the cost of the meal by a large margin. He was already used to the bland food, but it was still better than what he could make himself. Without a high cooking skill in his repertoire, he wouldn't be able to make anything tasty even if he tried. He had some points in the lower version of it, but without a class that used it, he wouldn't be able to level it up further. Roland looked around at the new faces. The town was growing. It would probably take a couple of months or even years before everything settled. He had arrived here sooner than he had anticipated, and the city wasn't in a good state yet. Even the auction house that he wanted to use as a means of selling his wares was still being renovated. The other adventurers were also waiting for it to show up. Selling everything at the guild wasn't the most lucrative thing a person could do. With time the facilities would be set up, but this would take some time. Roland wasn't in a hurry though. Unless his old enemies came to his doorstep, he could relax and wait. Training in the dungeon during the day and making repairs to his runic items during the night was his new schedule. His aim was to get to Tier 2 within a year. Bringing his home into working condition was a second priority, but that could be done with just money and time. Chapter 74 Renovation and Auction. Okay, Wayland was it? Do you want to add something to the project before we start? Give me a second. Roland grabbed a large parchment with a diagram on it. It wasn't a schematic of runes or anything close to that. It was the plan of his house. On this piece of paper he could see the dimensions and layout of his new home. This was the house plan along with the blueprints that the construction company he had hired was working on. He was a bit surprised at how modern they looked. The floor plans were quite detailed. By the looks of things, these people were experienced professionals. The man he was talking with was the foreman. He was tasked with keeping the workers in check and that everything went smoothly on the construction site. People like the architect or the company boss weren't here, so he was the one responsible for it all. Roland had already listed what he wanted. He wanted to have the whole building checked and renovated. All the broken boards on the floor were to be replaced with new ones. They would need to check if the brick walls were structurally safe. He had made some improvements to the old design. One was the iron bars in the windows that would make getting in a bit more difficult. He also ordered the construction workers to fence up his entire property. It wouldn't be used more as an indication not to trespass. Getting through a fence even with barbed wire wouldn't really be hard. People already had superhuman levels of strength and agility, vaulting over a 2 or 3 meter tall wall was easy. That didn't mean that there wouldn't be some surprises waiting for any trespassers on the inside. Roland went over the house blueprints once more before giving them back to the person in charge. How long will it take? Hard to say, a few days, a week at most. It would be best if you found yourself a place to stay till we are done. The foreman was a regular human being like him, his workers were quite mixed. He could see a large man that was part of the Goliath race, there were 2 dwarfs and even a gnome there. The smaller races had higher dexterity, so they would probably be responsible for things like painting the wood or replacing small moving parts. The large muscular man would probably have to carry all the heavy gear and dig up the ground for the new fence. Yes, of course. Roland expected something like this to happen. The thing that would be the most annoying was the special coating to preserve the wood. They would apply it with a large brush on fresh planks, but it would give out an intensive smell. It would be quite hard to spend a night in a place like that. A person would get headaches if they inhaled the vapors, so he would need to move out for now. The log cabin would get the same treatment, so it was better to move to an inn for the time being. The last option was camping out in a tent on his own land. He decided to move to the city, for now. He could use this time to visit all the shops and find out where everything was. The town was expanding fast. The construction workers were quite fast. Their specialized building classes allowed them to complete everything with minimal errors. Roland was surprised, but there were some advancements with building materials. This world even had its own version of cement and plaster-like substances. The alchemists were responsible for that. They mostly mixed some exotic ingredients together to get similar results. Monster remains were also important in making those mixtures, which made dungeons quite the hot commodity. This world had its own unique set of technological advancements. If he compared it to a strategy game, he would be in a civilization that abandoned modern science in favor of magic. Instead of steam or combustion engine technology, they were shifting towards mana technology, using it as fuel. This made a lot of sense, as it was a reusable source of energy found almost everywhere. It was in every living being, but mostly in the air. A person just needed to know how to absorb this abundant energy source. Even the mana stones only purified it for an increased absorption rate without producing it themselves. Roland's next big task would require him to harness this abundant source of energy. For this, he needed something akin to a battery. He actually had an idea of how such a thing was possible. One part of the equation was the mana stones that you received from monsters and beasts. He actually considered creating either a steam or combustion engine. With his blacksmithing skills, he would be able to make a piston and cylinder that was required for those. Customizing it to work with runes would be the tricky part. The problem was with how these runes weren't that customizable. He could place a small detonation rune to push the piston in the cylinder. That wasn't the hard part. To actually make it work, he would need the detonation rune to activate at set intervals. Intervals that needed to change if he wanted to. Otherwise, it would only spin on one set speed while constantly drawing his mana. He had something in that theme with his grindstone, but that one used a set runic structure that applied a constant push in one direction. It was quite a simple setup that constantly drew mana from the user. It was a simpler design over the engines from his old world, but it also required more power. A periodical infusion of mana to an impact rune would use up less energy while also conserving some momentum. He theorized that such a mixed engine would be more powerful and it would use less juice as well. It would also require a more intricate runic design as well as a piston with a cylinder that fit into each other tightly. Producing something like that with the tools that he had would be hard. if he was off by a millimeter the detonation would be unfocused, and the loss of energy during the motion would make it ineffective. He could also go with a more primitive steam engine design. He would only need to place a rune to heat up some water and make the steam push it instead. This would produce less power, but also a simple heating rune was quite energy efficient. Would be nice if I could play around with the settings of those runes. There will be a lot of trial and error involved in making an engine like that, also not sure about the uses. The biggest issue with bringing a hybrid engine into this world was its uses. He could probably slap it together and have it run in one way or another. But what would that give him? Could he get something out of that mechanical force that was produced? He could make the engine spin around to power a drill. He could tweak the design to get a push and pull motion, but what of it? He could already achieve this effect with the runic designs if he tweaked them slightly. The biggest question was if he could turn that energy into something valuable. Roland did make some calculations and did think there was a way to work something out. The hybrid steam engine was just one part of the equation, the other one was what it could produce. With the addition of a generator, he figured that he could produce electricity. Now came the big question, could electricity be stored as mana in some way? The lightning element was something that existed in this world. It was considered a higher tier school of magic and more difficult to learn. People with an affinity for it were rare amongst the mages that existed. If you had it, you were considered gifted, as lightning was very potent at delivering high amounts of damage. With this, Roland believed that electricity could be very potent as a power source. He just needed to find a way to store it as mana into something. While thinking about this, he headed back into Audiobook. It was time to look over the city again. He had spent most of his time going between the dungeon and his own house. This left the new town mostly unexplored. After a little jog, he was in one of his favorite restaurants. He was mostly here because the food was cheap while still somewhat tasty. After about a month of being here, certain things had changed. One of them being that the new auction house was going to be opening this very day. The new owners had rushed its production and some of the halls weren't finished, but they were opening it up with one of them being usable. After finishing up with his food, he decided to check it out. This reminded him about the time that he visited Edelgard for the first time. He also used the auction house to get all of his money for a long time before he was scouted by the gnome boss. Maybe if he refused him at that time, he would be still in Edelgard selling his improved scrolls or now runic weapons. He did gain a lot by signing a contract, but in the long run, it didn't pan out. Opening up a business was still something that he was thinking about, but now was not the time. The auction house could be used for selling his wares instead. He didn't plan on opening a workshop yet, he didn't have enough time to work full-time in it yet. Welcome everyone to the grand opening of Audiobook's official auction house. With the help of the mayor, Roland had arrived just in the nick of time to witness a gnome in a top hat and a cane doing the announcement. This was someone from the auction house, might have been the owner or the announcer. Next to him stood an older man in a tailored suit. He was of the human race and looked about 60 years of age. From what Roland knew, this was the town mayor. If he was here, then this place was probably being sponsored by the noble that owned this city. This spot would be very lucrative for anyone, so owning the auction house would bring the noble and the city a lot of money. They will probably forbid any other auction houses from opening. Or it will take some bribing for an opposing auction house to get started. Maybe some heavy taxation if the lord of the island agrees. This was nothing new. The rich got richer while the poor were forgotten. It was very smart to get into the auction house racket. This was the only place where regular adventurers could sell their wares and hope for a good price. Most of them didn't want to bother with things like selling, they would rather get drunk at the pub or hunt more monsters. Things like monocores and monster fangs could be dropped off at the Adventurer Guild at a minimal loss. But getting a deal for some kind of exotic crystal or a magic blade that was found in a chest was harder. Thus the auction house would be the preferred means of selling. Other adventurers, merchants, and sometimes even nobles would visit such places to spend their money. Unless you were friends with some kind of shop owner or blacksmith, this was the best place to drop off your loot. The people from the auction house would take care of everything. The client only needed to return the next day to get his coins without worrying. That is if their item made it through the appraiser. Not every little trinket would be put up for auction. With that, I would like to invite everyone to the first Allbrook auction, free of charge of course. Roland perked up at the free of charge part of the announcement. He had spent a lot of time selling his scrolls at the auction house in Edelgard. He didn't really have the time or money to buy anything back then though. He was also hired to work at the company, so the need for selling or buying wasn't there. Everything he needed was provided by his old boss at a lower price than what he could get it for at the auction. After a while, he kind of forgot about that place and only visited regular stores instead. Maybe there will be something interesting, something that could help me with my generator problem. Other people were also interested, so it would be a packed hall this time around. After further investigation, the auction wasn't actually free, at least not for anyone that wanted to buy something. The people could stay in the back and watch, but if someone wanted to buy anything, they had to buy a small paddle with a number on it. With it, they could raise it when they were interested in something, like in all the other auction houses. Roland wasn't that strapped for cash, plus the fee was only one small silver coin. With this, he was also able to get a seat for himself, while anyone that wasn't willing to pay had to stand in the back. The auction house looked like a small theater, quite similar to the other ones that Roland visited before. This stage was slightly bigger than the one he saw back in Edelgard. This might have been because this was the only one in this auction building for now. While back in Edelgard there were smaller ones for the less expensive items. We would like to bring your attention to our first item. This is a. The person on the stage was a beautiful lady of the elven variety. This is something that never changed. They always brought out stunning-looking women to attract attention. With a beauty on the side, the buyers were willing to spend more. Something to do with the urge to show off in front of a potential mate. Or so Roland heard from someone mentioning it during a random pub conversation. The items that were shown weren't anything out of the ordinary. Some sets of quality healing and mana potions, some enchanted weapons, and sometimes some unique devices here and there. Due to this auction house only having one stage, the items varied by the quality and there wasn't any rhyme or reason to how they were presented. Roland expected this issue to be fixed the longer the auction house operated. Roland gave out a yawn. He had spent at least an hour sitting here without seeing anything worthwhile. He was mostly here to look at the item prices. They didn't differ much from the ones back in Edelgard. Everything cost slightly more though, which made sense as the weapons were mostly imported from outside and people had to account for shipping prices. This next item would be perfect for a present. Another thing came. The woman placed a box on the auction table. It wasn't that big, around 15 square centimeters. It looked to be some kind of music box. After placing it down, the woman pressed a button from the side. Roland was using his mana detection skill while looking at the items, which prompted him to notice something off. He squinted while looking at the contraption. A little horse popped out and started spinning around. The tune wasn't anything special, it sounded like a generic lullaby. That wasn't really what he was interested in. He looked at the item in question with the help of his skills. He could see runic pathways running all over it, some of them connecting to a mana stone that was sticking out on the side. Is that thing absorbing mana from the surroundings and running on it by itself? Normally any runic item required the user to insert some mana of their own. This one seemed to work in a different way. It was apparently activated by a press of a side button. This fact alone made Roland interested in this item. The starting price will be 4 large silver coins. He looked at the lack of paddles in the air. The item was a magical device but not really useful for the adventurers here. It was more of a present for a female family member. It could shed some light on his mana engine theory. If the item was working without needing an outside mana jolt, then it had to be storing mana in a different place. He decided to raise his number. Luckily no one else looked interested in this item, so he would get it for cheap. After investigating it further, he might be able to get through his bottleneck. Chapter 75 Moving Forward. Roland was sitting with a cup of tea in his hand. It looked like he was in a small dim-lit room. He was taking a sip of some kind of black tea that was still giving out steam. There was only one small table, one chair, and a small single-person bed squeezed inside of here. This made the young man recall some of the old dorm rooms that he used to stay in back in another life. That time he used to hate it, now it might have been something that he looked back to fondly. It was a simpler time, no monsters or evil cults were lurking in the darkness to get him back in those days. On the small table lay a box, a music box to be exact. It wasn't exactly in working order anymore as the springs and screws that kept it in place were laid out on the table. This was the very same item that he had bought at the auction house. He was now examining it after getting a place to stay for the night. The inns in the city were still jam-packed, but the adventurers still evaded the ones that cost a bit more. They would rather spend the night in the stables while spending the rest on food and alcohol. Then the following day they could spend the rest on health potions for the next expedition into the dungeon. This cycle continued till the adventurer in question either made enough money to rent themselves a room or they perished while trying. Not many adventurers could afford a home like Roland did. Gathering up 100 small gold coins would be something that would take years. Maybe if someone were lucky to find themselves a magic blade to pawn off, they could speed up the process. This is a bit unexpected, I guess the answer was right under my nose. Roland picked up a part of the music box that had runic patterns on it. Lucky for him, this item was of that variety and not a regular enchanted one. The weapons and armor that were auctioned off were mostly regular enchanted ones instead. He wasn't sure, but maybe the drops in the dungeon were of that type of magic equipment. What he was holding was just a plate of metal made from deep iron. The runic structure was condensed on it, which made it look smaller than whatever he could make. This item was certainly made by someone that was more skillful than he was. That didn't mean that he wouldn't be able to recreate it. With his debugging skill this would prove rather easy. The only problem would be improving on the design with his own knowledge. Roland expected to find some kind of special device or an item responsible for this music box working. This he did, but instead of one, it was a combination. The small plate that had the runic components in them also had a socket. This socket contained a marble-like item, an item that he was familiar with. A slime core, hey. This slime core was the magical mineral that was apparently able to store mana inside of it. There was a specialized runic structure around this socket that kept the slime core inside of it. He had examined it before dismantling the music box. What he saw was a siphoning effect that funneled the mana from the surrounding area into this slime core. This core worked as some kind of generator or battery. It was constantly discharging the mana it had stored back into the runic structure. Thus the music box was able to function. The button on the side that activated it just moved some parts and connected some runic traces. There was also one mana stone present to purify the mana from the surroundings. It was directly connected to the slime core, probably allowing it to work more efficiently by being in closer proximity to the battery. From how it looked, the runic components only needed a little jolt of magic at the start before they would work on their own. Besides the slime core, there was deep iron involved. He could clearly tell that the runic components were not deteriorating that fast. The small rune design and its simplicity gave the item longevity. Even when constantly turned on it was working just fine. It looked that if the magic rune didn't pass a certain threshold of mana usage, the runic components that it was composed of wouldn't break down. At least not when made from this deep iron. If this was some kind of other metal with a special mana gathering attribute was unknown. He would need to test it out on other metals to see if there was a difference. Well, this clears up a couple of things. The person that made this was probably an experienced runesmith. You don't see many runes at the high grade. This rune was of the high grade, which was something rare. Most of the items out on the market were of the intermediate grade, while high and above were hard to find. This was also why the wares that he made sold quite well. Probably the craftsmen weren't willing to give away the knowledge of their designs to just anyone. Thus most runesmiths ended up with average knowledge and made average grade runes. Improving on the design was a lot harder without a lot of trial and error. This would be a time-consuming process. It could also be costly if something went wrong. Badly connected rune components could be volatile, even explode. Roland was just happy that he could skip that process with his debugging skill. If he didn't have it, he would probably be still stuck scribing low-level runes. Maybe he would have to go work for some kind of runesmith that was willing to share their knowledge with him. With this skill, he had attained a degree of freedom, but this also caused him to have some holes in his basic knowledge. Was this battery structure something hard to make? It didn't look out of the ordinary. He was a classical case of someone that started running without having learned to walk properly first. Roland had placed the piece of metal to the side and got ready to go to bed. With this, he had something to look forward to. He had also ordered a basic forge to be made at his home. The building company luckily was able to do that. They would place it in the log cabin for now while his secret workshop remained underground. There he was planning to build his own furnace, one that was composed of runes. Through this he could only do after completing his runic generator design. Now after looking over this toy, it was finally a possibility. First, he would need to get his house back. He would also need copper wire and magnets. This was something he would need to create an electric generator. This was a device that converts mechanical energy into electrical power. How this worked was common knowledge from his old world, and it wouldn't be that hard to produce with his current skills. The hard part would be to harness this electrical current to then produce mana. He also needed it to produce more mana than there was introduced into the runic structure. Without that, the generator idea would fall flat. The first prototype would probably be quite crude, but he needed to test if this thing even had the merit to be improved later on. He had copper and magnets in his workshop already. He had gotten a few strong ones for his refrigerator design. They sealed the doors quite nicely. While thinking about the next few days, he went to sleep. Before anything could be done, he needed his house to be in working order. The following day Roland woke up early. He visited some shops to try and buy anything that could help him with the future mana generator design. One of the problems would be placing wires along his house to deliver the mana to all of his appliances. The ethereal pathways had a very limited range, so he would need to actually attach them to his generator. The people of this world did make wires for fences, so he would be able to just buy that. Those wires were thicker than electrical wires, but that would just make it easier to inscribe the runic traces on them. They would also deteriorate quite slowly with only runic pathways on them. Without runic components that had a spell structure, the metals didn't suffer that much damage. He could also place more than just one pathway for the mana to travel through the cable. This was all still only theoretical, as he still needed to make the devices capable of using these cables. Those would mostly be power tools like a drill or a belt grinder. This would have to wait till he got his hands on some better crafting utensils. For now, Roland used his time to check the shops for anything useful. The rest of his time was spent down in the dungeon. Leveling up to level 75 was still very much on his agenda. It wouldn't hurt to have a tier 2 class sooner rather than later. So he did, this time venturing to the levels below. What he found were more skeletons that were on fire along with more slimes. He was sure to hunt the latter ones more, as the slime cores could be used for his generator. Roland wasn't sure how many of them he could use, but he could hold on selling them until he figured out that part. Those two weren't the only monsters that he found down there. He was facing another common creature that he had faced before. It was a giant rat. This was a variation of the old foe that was dark crimson in coloring. The only difference between this one and the ones he saw back in the city of Kerwin. These ones were of higher level and also somewhat fire resistant. For him that was over level 70, this thing wasn't much of a problem. With a couple of stabs from his arming sword, the monster fell. It was quickly replaced by another one. These large rodents rarely wandered around alone. This is good practice. Roland used this chance to train himself when fighting multiple opponents. The trick was not to get yourself surrounded. This was easier in these corridors, as he just needed to move back while not letting any of the monster rats pass him on the side. If he wasn't careful, he might find himself up against a wall. That was still better than being surrounded. at least he wouldn't need to watch his back. He made quick work of the large rats that were about the size of a middle-sized dog. They were kind of a waste of time as the experience he was gaining didn't even go over 10. None of these critters had any mana stones in them either, and rat teeth or claws didn't sell for all that much. I need to get to the lower levels. I won't get much experience unless I face off against lower level tier 2 monsters. This was a fact that he already knew. Ever since attaining his third tier 1 class, leveling up had gotten hard. Even after battling tier 2 monsters and all of those bandits, he wasn't rewarded with that much. Using his time to craft high tier runic equipment would bring him better results. He was also running low on the crafting schematic exploit that let him get to this point so fast. Roland pulled out the labyrinth map and started examining it. He was now on the starting section of the third floor. The monster attacks were more frequent here and the corridors were also wider. This allowed the monsters more area to maneuver. There was also a chance of them sneaking up behind a person from one of the side corridors that were passed. While taking a moment to eat something, he looked for the fastest way to the level below. He wanted to take it slowly, but these monsters weren't proving very lucrative. Any of the monster body parts he could sell weren't worth more than the simplest magic scroll he could make. Farming them for money wouldn't be something worthwhile, and the experience was also bad. This was still the safest way of leveling up his warrior-type skills, so he was bearing with it. After eating, he ventured forth to do more battling, but now if there wasn't a mana stone or a creature core, he would just leave everything behind. This labyrinth apparently ran 10 levels deep. Each level increased the monster level by about 5. On the 10th and final level, you would face creatures close to level 50. Some monsters at the second tier could be seen there, which meant that most adventurers below the silver rank wouldn't be seen wandering there alone. At most, a full party of steel adventurers could hope to survive down there. He continued on his way, going down to the lower levels. The further down he went, the less adventurer he saw. This meant that there would be more loot to find, but also more monsters to go through. At the higher levels, a person didn't run into that many monsters as all the other adventurer parties were taking them out. At the 4th level, he battled another new monster. It looked like an iguana and could actually produce something akin to a fire breath. This was also the first time that he actually needed to activate his magic shield to defend himself against this flame breath. It was quite large for something considered a baby. While the rats were the size of a middle-sized dog, this one would be akin to a larger breed. It was close in specs to a full-grown wolf, and it had some sharp teeth to go with it. Roland blocked the fire attack with his shield. The activated magic was enough to not make him feel any heat. The flame resistance rune was working just fine. The moment the monster ran out of breath was the time for him to strike. This time around he used his mana thrust rune to skewer the red lizard-looking monster. The salamander wasn't able to react in time. Taking one hit from the torrent of mana was enough to slay this creature. The monster's head exploded into many tiny chunks which bloodied the wall behind it. He could feel that this one had a mana stone hidden in its abdomen. He needed to stick his hands into its guts to pull it out. It wasn't the best feeling, but after having slain many monsters he was used to this sort of job. He looked at the defeated monster while wondering if there was really nothing worthwhile for him to take from it. At times like these was when he recalled that having party members had its upsides. He wouldn't need to go through dead monster carcasses at least. Before he could decide on his next move, another one of those salamanders appeared. Probably attracted by the stench of blood. Training my shield proficiencies is quite easy in this sort of place. He looked to the monster that was ready to breathe out some fire. His shield started glowing in a blue hue that had a slight red tint to it. The moment the fire attack connected with its magical surface, it started getting dispersed. Roland noticed that defeating this type of monster was quite easy if you managed to resist its breathing attack. It remained stationary afterward. Probably the usage of mana left its body unable to evade any attacks coming for it in that time frame. If other monsters like this had the same weak point, would be something that he needed to find out later. After this baby salamander bit the dust, another one appeared. It looked like he was attracting unwanted attention. He preferred to take the sneaky approach while biding his time, but this would also be a good opportunity for gathering experience. Roland smirked a little bit and used the handle of his sword on his shield. A loud sound was produced to get the monster's attention on it. This one, instead of delivering a fire attack, decided to charge towards him. Its mouth opened up wide as it tried chomping down on one of his legs. But the only thing that monster got to chomp down was cold hard steel as Roland delivered a shield bash to its head. With his blacksmith levels of strength, it was enough to momentarily stop it in its tracks. With a little poke to the eye socket, the monster was down for the count just like the other ones. The spot he was in was slowly getting crowded by the salamander monster corpses. As it looked, this wasn't all, as he heard the shuffling of lizard claws from the distance coming his way. I guess the fun starts from this level on. Roland looked over his gear that was still in working condition. There was enough juice left in the runes for him to stay here for a couple of more hours. Maybe now he could get those skills up at a more moderate pace. Chapter 76 Crimson Adventurer 70th level. This place looks the same like all the other levels. Wasn't that hard to get here, not long and we will reach the 10th level. A group of young adventurers that looked to be in their late teens were going through a dimly lit path. It was a group of 4 people, 2 males and 2 females. The girls had lighter armor on them while the 2 men had heavier. It looked like the 2 were warrior types while the other were the more nimble variant. Don't get overconfident, Rudy, you always had a big head. A girl with neck-length brown hair called out to a red-haired boy. He was the person that mentioned the 10th floor of the dungeon they were in. The whole party here was composed of humans, with the girl that spoke out at the front. She was in the middle of kneeling down and looking at an out-of-place floor tile. Never bad to have confidence. The young man chuckled back while looking at the girl on the ground. He could see her moving her short sword towards the floor tile. The ground here looked like it was made from large square-shaped rocks that were just dropped into position. They weren't very even, but they were enough to let people move through them without stumbling around. Did you find something, Kira? The other girl from the party called out. She had a bow in her hand and a similar short sword to her side. Before she could prod for more answers, she heard a strange noise coming from the side. The moment that Kira poked the rock slab enough, a couple of darts shot out from the wall. With no one walking forward, the darts impacted the wall on the other side with no one getting hurt. Just a small trap. There are a few more of these ahead, so give me a minute. Take your time, but we need to hurry, we only have a few hours till sundown. The trip back will probably take us an hour from this level. Can't we just go through? Those things don't look that deadly to me. The other male moved forward. He was the largest person here at over 190 centimeters of height with a more robust build. He was heavily armored, with a shield and sword combo. Why do we have to only have meatheads in our party? The girl that was disarming the trap moved up while frowning. The girl with the bow just shrugged without saying a word. Go ahead, Myron, I'm sure the poison in those darts won't be a problem. Hope that discount steel armor will be able to hold out. The armored man looked at the girl named Kira and then over to the darts that were embedded in the corridor wall. They looked quite sharp and also punched through the hard wall surface cleanly. The man gave out a grunt before backing away, probably not sure if his armor could take it. That's what I thought, Sansa, please watch my back. The girl with the bow nodded. Her hair was long and obsidian. She had a more eastern look to her. She stood watch with her bow drawn while staring into the distance of the long corridor. At the end of it she could see some kind of opened gate. It looked similar to the entrance of the Albrook City dungeon. The girl knew that that type of structure indicated something, there could be monsters or treasure behind it. It took the girl named Kira about 20 minutes to get rid of all the traps. The party of 4 was now standing at the end of this passage. The guys moved forward with the later, heavier armored one at the helm. He had his shield up and with his sword in hand, he was inching toward the unknown area. There might be monsters inside, be careful. Yeah. Rudy complained from the side but followed closely after the main tank of the party. After venturing through the larger opening at the end of the corridor, the party ended up in a wide open area. Nothing in here. All of them entered after looking around from the entrance. The room was large and it also had a high ceiling. They could also see another opening with a gate. It looked like there was another tunnel past this room and nothing else. Only one exit. Kira commented while looking around. There wasn't anything in here, no monster remains or signs of other adventurers. Not like any of those would be left for anyone to see. After about half an hour any untouched body would start to vanish. This group of young adventurers knew this fact but none of them had ever witnessed it firsthand. We should go, probably other people came through here and the monsters didn't reappear. It didn't look like there was anything in here. Kira looked around but she didn't seem to see anything out of the ordinary. She decided that it would be best to just move on and hurry it up. Might just be a dummy room, you find them from time to time. These dungeons are large, not all of the rooms have traps and monsters in them. Thank you for the lesson, Professor Kira. Rudy replied while chuckling. The brown-haired girl stomped her foot in anger a bit but then just moved towards her party members. The two warriors moved to the front of the party again while the two girls trailed slightly behind. Wait. They were about halfway through the room before the girl noticed something. No, quickly, run for the tunnel. Kira called out while bolting towards the exit on the other side of the large room. There was a faint clicking sound, soon after the whole room started rumbling. The walls started shaking around, small openings in the walls closer to the high ceiling started to open up. The other three adventurers were a bit surprised by their friend's reaction but they quickly ran after her. Before they could reach the exit a wall of rock slammed down, Kira was just quick enough to run into it. She started banging on it with her fists but the wall was far too sturdy to be broken. The party of four was clearly trapped in here as the opening that they came through was also sealed by a similar wall of hard stone bricks. We are trapped. This was a trap. Hey Kira, I thought you were supposed to be good at detecting traps. I don't know, this trap is different, there was magic involved, I can't sense magic traps yet. Kira and Rudy started shouting at each other while the two other party members looked around. They could see the holes opening up wider till they were about human-sized. They looked large enough for them to go through but before they could explore that possibility they heard a hissing sound coming from those large holes. You two stop arguing. Enemies are coming. The two turned around and were quick to spot what their archer friend meant by that. Out of those openings in the walls, monsters started to appear. The first thing that this party of adventurers saw were bright red eyes that were reptilian in nature. One of the monsters dropped down to the ground, its clawed raptor-like legs caused the ground to crack. The creature that they were looking at was reptilian in nature, its body was coated with crimson leathery scales. It was the height of a smaller human at about 170 centimeters but some of its companions were slightly larger. It had a lizard-like head along with a crown of spiky frills that extended from their foreheads to their necks. It had a mostly upright humanoid-like posture but was leaning forward slightly. Its hands were composed of 4 large fingers, the second one that was closer to their body was twice as long as the others. On it, they could see a large claw that was probably meant for ripping into their opponent's flesh. Lesser troglodytes. The monsters continued to drop out of those openings till there were about 10 of them in this room. The 2 males from the adventurer party moved to protect their female companions. The monsters started to quickly fill up the locked area, battle was the only option left. One of the troglodytes that was the closest to them charged forward. The other ones behind him were quick to notice the juicy enemies as well. The monsters opened up their mouths while hissing, their sharp teeth were on display along with their drooling tongues. It was clear that those large lizards were set on devouring these 4 human adventurers. Myron stepped forward with his large tower shield in hand. Before the monster could swing that giant clawed hand on him, he shot towards it. The monster slammed into the thick steel shield with his head and was flung backward. Soon after, it found an arrow sticking out of its eye socket as Sansa, the party's archer, used her bow skills on it. The monster convulsed on the ground but this didn't scare off its companions that charged in, their faces filled with maddened rage. Soon the party of 4 found themselves surrounded. There was nowhere to run and the 2 warriors had to contend with 2 or 3 monsters each. This still left some to slip past their barricade and getting dangerously close to the 2 girls. These 2 had roles of supports and specialists. Sansa was having trouble using her bow with the lizard monsters so close by. Kira had to use her short sword to defend herself, but she wasn't that good in a direct fight, her class being a thief. Rudy managed to step in to defend his companion. Before Kira got ripped to shreds by the lizard's talons, he pushed his long spear through its head. The girl was saved, but this act of bravery would cost him dearly, as the troglodyte behind him used this chance to sink its teeth into the youth's shoulder. "Rudy!" The girl called out in panic as she saw the monster biting her companion, but she was in no position to help him. Another monster was on a collision course with her. It looked that even if they slew some of them, new ones appeared out of the openings in the walls. Their whole formation was broken. It looked like this would be their last adventure. They would end up as a nice meal for these lizard-like monsters, but before they met their demise a loud sound was heard. Following it, one of the monsters dropped dead in its tracks, a large arrow made out of sharp ice going through its head. "Get down!" Someone shouted out from the distance before a hail of ice arrows descended into this large open room. Each one of these magical attacks flew towards a monster. The aim was true and the troglodytes were unable to resist this high-tier magic. It only took 1 hit from a magical arrow to deliver a fatal blow. This gave the 4 adventurers time to reorganize themselves. They huddled up together while pouring healing potions on their wounded friend. The monsters quickly changed to a new opponent that was standing on the other side of this room. From where he came was a mystery to these people, but they wouldn't complain as he was helping them. 7 of the monsters were killed instantly, but there were still more coming. A group of 3 of them charged at their new opponent while the 4 adventurers watched from afar. The person that came to their help looked to be in a heavier set of armor, similar to the one the warrior from their party was wearing. It was in a dark red color and had some strange runic patterns inscribed into them. They couldn't see the man's face as his face was hidden behind a sturdy metal helmet. It was rounded to fit a person's skull with an attached front visor. This face-covering visor was wide with a rectangular slit for vision and had dotted cutouts on the lower half of the face for ventilation. The visor of this helmet seemed to be filled out by something akin to dark-colored glass that was glowing from time to time. This person had a large kite shield in one hand. The other hand wasn't holding any weapon, but there was a mace strapped to his side. The monsters continued to charge at him, but he didn't seem to care. The group of adventurers wasn't sure why this person looked so relaxed, but soon they would understand. This armored knight moved his hand up at the moment the monsters were only a few meters away. The gauntlet he was wearing started glowing for a moment before a discharge of ice shards was seen. The lizard-like monsters found themselves being shredded by ice magic that quickly turned them into statues. The ones that didn't die right away were promptly finished off by a swing of that mace. 1 hit to the head was all that he needed. "Is that a silver rank? Maybe a gold?" The group let out a sigh of relief as they saw the new adventurer overpower these monsters with ease. It was clear to them that this person was of a higher tier compared to them by how many skills and spells he was activating. Someone below tier 2 would not be able to use that many enchanted items even if they had them. 3 lesser troglodytes remained. They all charged at the man in the armor. The adventurer didn't retreat. Instead, he took a step forward. The metal graves along with his boot gave off a faint blue light that changed to orange the moment it touched the ground below. This sent some kind of ripple through the earth below. Thick spikes made from hard rock then burst from the ground, impaling the charging monsters. They were strong enough to pierce their hard bodies. He didn't even need to finish them off after turning them into large pincushions. The room that was filled with monster howls and screams of people was now quiet. All of the monsters were now dead and the openings in the walls were starting to close themselves. The large pathways through which this group of adventurers came in were also opening up. The slabs that were blocking them were sliding back up, probably to recharge before the next time the trap would be sprung. Rudy was grasping his aching shoulder through which the lesser troglodyte bit through. He had received healing potions, but it would take a few minutes before this injury healed itself. Are you okay? I'm fine, but what are we going to do about him? Rudy answered while whispering the last part to Kira. They all were now looking at the person that saved them. The person was just walking without a worry in the world and sticking a dagger into the monsters' bodies. It took them a moment to notice that he was taking out a mana stone each time he did that. He was totally ignoring them. Without even a side glance, he was continuing to go around the monster corpses plucking out mana stones. He was strangely proficient at it. Normally they would need to go through the entire body and hope for the best. Only after finishing up with the stones, they saw him going towards them. His height was close to their party tank, which made him look more imposing from close up. Are you new here or just stupid? Excuse me. Kira was the one to reply. The other party members moved closer to each other. The faces of the two men from the party scrunched up, but they weren't willing to shout at the person that cleared out this trap by himself. Didn't you get the labyrinth map? A map? Was there something like that? The girl looked to her party members for answers, but they just shrugged without knowing what this was about. That's why noobs are. The man muttered under his breath before speaking up again. Never mind, you should go up to the 6th floor and level up before returning here. If you continue like this you will die. The party got a quick lecture by the person that saved them. He was clearly an adventurer that was a tier above them, so they kept their mouths shut. Soon the man in the dark red armor ventured out through the door that they wanted to go through. The adventurers were left here with all the corpses. Only the mana stones were missing, but they could probably disassemble them for some money. Kira. What is it, Rudy? What's a noob? The two looked at each other while the footsteps of the adventurer that saved them started to slowly fade away. Chapter 77, Choosing a New Class. Roland slowly left the room in which the monster massacre happened. He didn't want to hang around other adventurers for too long if there was no business relationship between the two parties. He was slightly ticked off as the group of youngsters had ruined his grinding spot. This was the 7th level of the labyrinth. It was getting close to the boss room that was on the 10th. One day while adventuring he found a little secret room, all thanks to his debugging skill and mana sense. It was directly above that trap room where the lesser troglodytes waited. Those monsters would spawn in a hidden chamber. There was a secret tunnel that connected to it from the 6th floor above, all behind a hidden opening in one of the tunnels. The monsters would be confined in a small room and wait for someone to come into that large chamber. When the trap was sprung they would be allowed to exit. When they followed a narrow corridor they would appear right above the 7th floor's trap chamber. Thus the trap would be sprung and the people below would have to face off against these monsters. This wasn't the important part. He used the fact that the monsters were trapped in a small chamber for himself. For someone who could make runic bombs and grenades, this was a great spot to quickly level up. He had used it several times by tossing in such explosives or using spells that had a wide area of effect. To his surprise, when he arrived today the room was already empty. The trap was activated, which wasn't something that normally happened here. The labyrinth was already mapped out by the guild and anyone who bought a map would know this trap. It was easily avoidable, only parties that wanted to farm the lesser troglodytes would bother entering this room. The monsters looked similar to lizardmen, had high physical resistance and strength. Most adventurers would rather fight smaller groups of monsters. This trap was far too dangerous, so most people avoided it. The monsters weren't very resistant to magic though, which made them perfect for Roland's grinding initiative. Roland moved through the narrow corridors to see who activated the trap. To his surprise it was a bunch of low-level adventurers. They were all around the 35th level. The lesser troglodytes were also close to that, but they outnumbered the intruders 5-1. He knew that the young adventurers would be killed if he didn't react. The monsters didn't pose a threat to him at this point, even in a wide open area. He decided to use up some of the runic charges of the armor he had inscribed, and so now he was here. There were two good things that came out of this predicament. One was the mana stones that he had still managed to procure for his crafting. Then there was still the experience that he managed to gain. After glancing at the status screen he now knew what it was time for a big change. Name: Roland Arden L75. Classes: T1 Mage L25 Secondary, T1 Runic Mana Scribe L25X, T1 Runic Blacksmith L25 Main. HP: 794/794, MP: 2824/2824, SP: 1124/1124. Strength: 59, Agility: 40, Dexterity: 87, Vitality: 59, Endurance: 68, Intelligence: 118, Willpower: 107, Charisma: 17, Luck: 10. Debugger L6, Circuitry L7, Tinkerer L8, Identify L9, Basic Mana Shaping L9, Basic Mana Regulation L9, Mana Sense L9, Basic Rune Mastery L9, Basic Rune Scribing L9, Basic Smithing Mastery L9, Basic Rune Craft L9, Runic Blacksmith Size L9, Blacksmith's Heat Sense L9, Basic Rune Compression L9, Ethereal Pathways L9, Basic Mana Reinforcement L9, One-Handed Swordsmanship L9, Heavy Armor Proficiency L9, Shield Proficiency L9, Blunt Weapon Proficiency L9, Hand-to-Hand Combat L3. Spearmanship L2. Roland was finally at the maximum level. It was time for that class change that he was working towards all this time. He had managed to level up some of the combat skills as well, but not all. He stuck to using swords and maces, but there just wasn't enough time to take care of the rest. He would need months, maybe even years, to increase his spearmanship or axe-wielding proficiencies. Roland wasn't really aiming to be a master of all weapons, 2 were more than enough for him. He used some fast grinding methods to level up faster. Even though the monsters were low-leveled, there were a lot of them. There was a boost to experience if you killed more than one monster in a short amount of time. It wasn't much, but at this point, his experience gaining had slowed down to a crawl. Roland had now lived in this city for over a year. Only now did he achieve the 25th level of his runic blacksmith profession. He had thought that this dungeon would be a gold mine of experience, but that wasn't entirely true. But he had limited himself by not venturing past the 10th level of this dungeon. Past it was the volcanic area of this dungeon where only Tier 2 monsters appeared. He wasn't a true Tier 2 class, he would rather be safe than sorry. While going solo, he was still able to gain some experience towards his weapon skills and armor proficiencies. He had maxed out a few, and with his level now hitting 75, he was finally ready to give his next class change a try. With this, he decided to make a beeline for the exit. After going through this labyrinth repeatedly for a year, he knew it like the back of his hand. With the help of his high intelligence stat, remembering these corridors wasn't that hard. At this point in time, he didn't even need to look at the map that much. There were some secret spots that weren't charted down, just like the secret room with the lesser troglodytes. There were some shortcuts between levels. Luckily for him, thanks to his skills, he was able to spot them. From time to time he came across runic traces in the walls. Through them finding the secret chambers was easy. With a quick mana infusion, these secret rooms would open up. Some of them were just stairs going up, while others were hidden areas with irrespionable treasures. This place was still quite low-leveled, so he never did find anything costly, but some of the treasures could be sold off. Being a blacksmith, he could inscribe runes into armor and weapons, then resell them on the market for an inflated price. After poking a certain spot with his finger, a path opened up. It was just a corridor with winding stairs going up. Roland entered and moved up through it. After a couple of minutes he was out on the 3rd level. From this point, he would need to travel through the dungeon normally. Roland looked around this place a couple of times. There were still many adventurers here, but not as many as before. The foolhardy ones had been weeded out in the first year of the dungeon's opening. Now not many of them ventured into the lower levels or past the 10th one that was for silver adventurers and up. In time he was walking up the rocky stairs that led to the exit of this dungeon. On the outside things had changed as well. For one thing, there were guards in front of the entrance. They would check everyone's adventurer's cards before letting them venture forth. This was all due to a certain foolhardy farmer's demise after entering the dungeon. That person didn't make it far before being devoured by one of the monsters. Some other adventurers found his body getting nibbled on by a salamander. The rumors were that he was unwilling to accept his farmer class and wanted to become an adventurer. Further away was a large store. The person that had been here selling magic potions at the entrance had expanded. It was true that the ones that came first were the ones that profited the most. Roland didn't see the young girl or the old man combo. They could now hire other people to do that work for them while they sat back at the store. Some of the people that attempted the same line of work weren't that lucky. He heard rumors of some of the merchants getting robbed and their potion selling business going under. Roland was now far enough from the dungeon. He went behind a tree and removed most of the red armor that he was wearing and placed it back into one of his spatial bags. This one was much larger than regular ones and was worn by him on his back. He stuffed it behind his armor plate, which made it a bit uncomfortable to carry around, but he needed it to be wide enough. This was due to what was hidden inside. He reached inside and started pulling. Soon a wheel appeared, followed by the rest of a peculiar transportation device. It had two round wheels that had something similar to rubber on them. To the side of the back wheel was a chain that connected below the sitting area. This was a bicycle that Roland had made. It didn't look anything like the modern variant that he was used to seeing in his old life. The seat that he sat on was quite long and connected to the handlebar directly. There were no pedals for him to move his feet around either. This thing was powered by mana directly. He just made a rest for his feet a bit to the front. He sat down on it, and after injecting some mana he was up and running. Roland used the main road that was somewhat paved to the dungeon at this point. The people that he passed gave him some strange looks, but he was used to it by now. He was known by them as the strange craftsman that lived out of the city. At least as his disciple, as most people didn't want to believe that someone at 16 could be a runic craftsman. The trip to the dungeon would take him more than half an hour on foot, but with this new bike, he made it back under 10 minutes. His house had been changed a couple of times since he arrived, but the most eye-catching thing was the large log wall that also had a barbed wire part at the top. He had been visited by nosy people a couple of times, but with some contingencies in place they found themselves incapacitated. Some did slip it past the magical traps, but just as he had planned, they didn't find his main workshop. The only things that he lost were iron and steel tools that could be easily replaced. Everything was walled and fenced up, even the log cabin where he kept his regular furnace and tools. That place was mostly what the thieves set their eyes on, so it was easily defendable with some shock runes plastered on the ground or walls. He didn't care much about his garage, as where the magic happened was downstairs. That was also where he was heading now. Roland needed to prepare for his next class change. This would be best done behind closed doors where no one would bother him. There was a chance of him passing out as the last time. He would rather do this while being in a safe space that was behind illusionary runes. The inside of his home looked decent enough. Everything was cleaned up during the renovations and all the wooden panels were painted over. He even got himself a couple of cheap rugs to make it a bit cozier, though without a vacuum cleaner he had to do it the old-fashioned way during the weekly cleaning drive. He was still living alone. With the trust issues he had built up throughout the years, it was hard to create new relationships. The people in the Adventurers Guild knew him as that guy that wears crimson heavy armor. It was a pre-made armor set that wasn't that rare around the city. The only thing that he customized was the color along with the helmet. There were runes in each part. It took some time to get the hang of it, but it worked similar to a magic book. He just needed to focus on the body part to cast a spell. Some pieces had more than one runic structure to add to his repertoire. This armor still suffered from the same drawbacks as all his old gear. It wore down quite fast. He needed to repair it constantly, but it was good enough to last him through a prolonged dungeon run. His new gear didn't help during discussions with others though. Roland was never the one to start the conversation, and there was no purpose in teaming up with anyone in this dungeon as long as he was careful. He had managed for this long without many problems, and now was the time to take a step forward. Okay, what do I need? He locked the door behind him and was also sure to activate a defensive runic structure close to the door handle. There was a sign outside to knock and wait. If anyone grabbed the handle first, they would be tasered. It wasn't quite that late, but the sun was already setting. He didn't expect any visitors, so it would be on them if something happened. It was time to go downstairs or over to a small closet that only had some rags in it. At least that's what it looked like to others. With a couple of strategic presses of this illusion magic lock, a path down was revealed. There was also a lock on the door for an added safety measure. Behind it were the stairs down along with another door, this one very sturdy looking and made from thick slabs of metal. He needed to really give these a push to get them open. He was planning on making them even heavier after getting that status boost from getting a Tier 2 class. On the inside was his workshop. He had used some earth magic to make it wider and deeper. This he had to do by himself, but with some basic building knowledge, he knew where to place all the supportive columns. If the place collapsed on him during his work, he would be having a bad time. On the inside were all the usual things like a workbench with all his old tools. There was a forge sticking out from the wall, it connected to the chimney of his house. But there were special runes that filtered the smoke out as well. This way, even if he was working down below, it wouldn't be smoking excessively. In a side room behind closed doors was his crowning invention. A runic engine. After bumbling about for half a year, he had finally managed to get a working model. This one was a steam model that worked by heating up water and converting it to mechanical force by steam. This was all done to produce electricity that then was stored in a special magic generator. His assumption of gaining mana out of electricity had borne fruit. He was now able to produce renewable energy on a smaller scale. This engine worked similar to the ones used in trains. The heating was done by small heating runes instead of fuel, though. The boiled water would produce steam and pressure. It would push a cylinder back and forth to generate mechanical force. This mechanical force was then used in an electric generator that he fashioned from a magnet and copper coils. The produced energy from this was then transferred by some wires into the special battery unit that he had made. He based it on the rune design and materials that he saw in that music box. The produced energy was higher than what it took to keep the heated runes running. Thus he had made something close to a perpetual motion machine. It wasn't quite that, as the strain on the materials existed, plus the runes and components had to be replaced periodically. He had it in a smaller room behind closed doors due to the loud noise that it made. It wasn't perfect, but thanks to it he was able to create his power tools and also power some other magical devices around his house. With time he hoped to improve on the design, but for now, it just worked. Improving it wasn't on the agenda for today. He had a Tier 2 class quest to finish. He was already dreading the thought of what it could entail this time. The first one was easy enough, just scribing one small runic spell. The other one was harder, as he had to make a ladle without any proper blacksmith knowledge to speak of. This time he expected a crafting-related test as well, but there also could be something more. He brought out the class change crystal to start it. A Solaria church had been built here recently, so now he could just go buy those there. He hoped that he would be able to pass the test on the first try, but if not, he could just get more crystals. He was making some money with his adventuring, and there wasn't a shortage of those crystals yet. Here goes nothing. Roland looked over his stats before sitting down in a chair. He had the crystal in his hand and a bucket was to the side. He hoped that he wouldn't need to use it, but it was better to have it on standby. The test wouldn't let him take anything from the outside. The only thing he needed to worry about was not getting any visitors while being here. Soon he activated the crystal and was back at his old apartment building. He didn't look around at all this time around and just went to the recreation of his old apartment room. The PC was quickly activated. The list of classes he could choose from had increased as well. This was mostly due to now having some Tier 2 classes to pick from. Weaponsmith, Armorsmith, the runic variations are there too. He started going through them one by one. The classes that were above Tier 1 were in a separate section and easy to spot. There weren't that many compared to the lower tier ones, which had probably increased due to him gaining more combat-related skills. No mage-related tier 2 classes as expected. There is a tier 2 scribe class, also an advanced runic mana scribe. Scrolls had been a good way of earning money for him and added to his combat repertoire. The biggest drawback of that class was the meager stat gains. Runesmith, it is there. The fabled class was there. It felt less special after he had attained the runic blacksmith one already. He knew that it wouldn't add much besides letting his skills reach higher than the basic tier. Hey, what is this class? There was a peculiar class showing up on the screen. It was placed further away from the other ones and looked like it was above them in that way. The sprite looked similar to a runesmith, but it was a heavily armored version. It held a runic hammer in one hand while in the other one was a sword, which made him think it was some kind of combination class. Runesmith Lord? So these types of classes weren't just rumors. Chapter 78 Tier 2 Trial Part 1. Runesmith Lord. Roland stopped while looking at the moving pixel art that only had 3 frames of movement. It looked like a more armored variation of the runesmith class. It was clearly some kind of evolved version and it was available to him. Didn't I read something about this? When he was back in the Arden estate, he went through the library several times. With no internet or games, there wasn't really much to do in this world. As an adult, he was past his childhood days, so he didn't waste time on kid games like tag. The only thing left for him was training and reading books. He recalled that one of these books had a passage about some hidden special classes. One of them was the mana-related classes like Mana Warrior. They were quite easy to get with a corresponding aptitude for mana. Past those were the prestige classes like Runic Scribe or Runic Blacksmith that he had gotten along the way. Then there were ones that were even rarer. The way that this class appeared on this screen here showed him that it was one of those. He had no way of knowing how good this class was, though. It could be worse than a runic armorsmith or weaponsmith for crafting purposes. It could not bring much to the table for him who already had one cheat skill in the form of debugging. But there it was, what looked to be another rare class option that he didn't think would be there. He was hoping to get a class that mixed combat and crafting in some way. Could this one be it? Roland looked over the other class choices. There was another one that he originally hoped to get. It was the Runic Battlesmith class. It was there with the basic variant as well. After leveling up his basic weapon proficiencies and gaining a lot of experience by fighting monsters, this was also unlocked. Now it didn't seem like the obvious choice anymore. There was a new contender. This left him with 5 choices: Advances Runic Mana Scribe, Runic Armorsmith, Runic Weaponsmith, Runic Battlesmith, and finally Runesmith Lord. He didn't even take the original Runesmith class into consideration, as it wouldn't really give him anything new. There were no mage-type classes available to him, and depending on his Tier 2 class he might be able to level up some of the basic skills past the threshold with a different class. Will this Runesmith Lord let me advance my scribing skills past the basic ones? I feel like the Lord part implies something. He hovered with the mouse cursor over this class but also looked at the Runic Battlesmith one. After some deliberation, he decided to go with the Lord variant. This world had a thing about putting noble titles above all other things, so it might have been the same with these classes. I can always fail the class change trial on purpose if it seems lackluster. With the infusion of money, he could just go buy another class change crystal. It was normal for some people to look into the trials and judge if the class was a fit for them. The trials more or less showed what the class would be about. The crafting classes required a person to fashion items of various kinds, while the battle classes required you to combat. What would this one force him to do? Maybe he would need to craft a full set of runic armor along with a weapon? That would actually not be a bad thing, as he would get some free experience and knowledge with the trial. Here goes nothing. He nodded and clicked on the icon. The PC did its thing and the VR headset popped out. It looked slightly different though, like a more advanced model. Roland looked over it before placing it on top of his head. He wasn't sure if it was because of the Tier 2 trial, but that might have been the case. Roland hadn't been here for some years. the last time was his blacksmithing class change. He had to get used to the flash of white light as he got transported into the next trial room. The first one was a smaller library where he just needed to scribe down a simple glowing rune. Then there was a smith's workshop where he had to produce a magical ladle. Both those classes made him produce something, and that is why he was confused about the trial area that was produced this time around. He looked around and noticed that he was in some kind of large arena. It was similar to a Roman Colosseum that he saw in some movies. There were differences though. For one thing, there was no place of an audience anywhere, just walls. This arena was circular in shape, the ground was covered in plain sand. There were a couple of eye-catching things here. For one, there were 4 large gates on each side, 2 were made from wood while the other 2 from metal. The walls were quite high and stretched up to the ceiling for a good 100 meters. The area inside was about the size of a football field. There were many torches on the arched walls that lit up the place quite nicely. There was another thing that was out of place. A lone column stood close to the center of this arena. After looking around, Roland couldn't spot anything that was similar to the other 2 trials. There were no instructions, no books that he could read, nothing that indicated what this trial would be. The only tip was this place, being an arena, it indicated that this would be a combat-related task. If that was true, then there was another problem. He didn't have any weapons, what he was wearing was just a random tunic. He had leather boots along with pants, but he couldn't spot any weapons anywhere. Was he supposed to fight here with his bare hands? Was this runesmith lord class some kind of grappling profession? That doesn't make sense. There is something on that column. He spotted something red sticking out from that misplaced column. After walking over, he recognized it as a large red button. This thing looked quite out of place. It was bright red and placed on a rocky pillar. It had a certain magnetic feeling to it. The more he looked at it, the more he felt like pressing it. If I press this, the trial will probably begin. He walked back for now. Before pressing that red button, he took some time in examining this whole arena from top to bottom. He looked over every gate, even pressed his ear to it to see if he could hear something. But they all had a similar feeling to the apartment building. He couldn't really touch it, and the texture that looked like wood felt off. The rest of the arena was similar. He started running into invisible walls, and climbing the ones that were going up was also impossible. Soon he returned to the big red button, feeling like he just wasted 10 minutes on nothing. With a slight sigh, he moved his finger on the button. It was pushed in easily, and it took a moment to see a reaction. The entire space he was standing in started to rumble. The pillar with the button began to sink into the ground while another platform directly in the middle of the arena appeared. Roland stepped back and watched. The ground started shifting. It looked like the earth in the middle of this arena parted to the sides. There appeared a large hole. Before he could go over to see if there was something down there, a platform started to rise up. On it were several items that he was very familiar with. "Hey! Is that blacksmithing equipment?" He called out in surprise as he saw a large working forge along with blacksmithing tools show up before him. On this moving platform, he could see a forge, smelter, workbench, anvil, and all the other things that he always used for crafting. The rumbling continued. Apparently this wasn't quite over. The noise this time around was coming from the ceiling above. He looked up to see another hole opening there, then a familiar object appeared. It was a giant version of the hourglass that he had seen in the 2 previous trials he took. This one was quite large. The sand was dropping slowly, which indicated that he would have some time before the timer ran out. The big question was, what was it for? It's different this time around. There was one thing that was bothering him. There were no books in this workshop that appeared here. What was he supposed to do? The other trials had instructions for building items, but this time around there was nothing. There were all the resources and tools to craft weapons and armor, but no clear indication of what kind. Started picking up the tools and looking over them. There was no indication or clues. It was as if this trial wanted him to craft something, but the choice was up to him. He stopped for a second to rethink this. if he took too long the timer would run out before he made a single item. Luckily for him, the answer to his question came in the form of a sound coming from the distance. Hey! He looked to one of the wooden gates, there was a strange sound coming from it. He listened closely while wondering if he was hearing things, but there it was again. Some sort of scratching or clawing sound was coming from one of those large doors. What is that are there? It dawned on him then, what this test was all about. The sounds coming from there were probably monsters, this was an arena meant for fighting. He put one and one together and got his answer. He was supposed to craft his own weapons and armor, then face the monsters lurking behind that gate. This is going to be one of those unconventional trials. He tried recalling the books that he had read. They all stated that the tests were class-specific, but they mostly were segregated into some categories like crafting tasks, combat tasks, and fetch tasks. The latter consisted of having to go through a course to procure an item. This one seemed to be an unconventional one that combined two separate professions. Even the battlesmith class wouldn't require crafting to get through the trial. At most the smith would be able to repair the weapons that he or she was given. There was also another peculiarity about this trial compared to the other ones. Roland didn't receive any temporary skills that would belong to this runesmith lord class. He had no idea what this class was about without those. The trial was pointing at it being a hybrid crafting and combat class at least. Roland didn't have any time to stand around anymore. Now he knew that there was something lurking behind that door that he would need to kill. He had no weapons or armor. This problem he would solve by fashioning himself a weapon. What should I make, a sword or a mace? These were the two weapons that he was the most proficient in. A sword would be better on softer targets and also more nimble. The mace was good for larger, slower enemies and ones that were armored. I would prefer a sword, but will there be enough time? He asked himself while going through the materials. He felt that a sword could be better for the fact that he could utilize the sword runes he knew. The mace had one advantage though, it would be easier to make and required no sharpening or pinpoint precision crafting. It was more or less just a blunt metallic club. To make a proper sword he would require a lot more time. With the mace, he wouldn't even need to make a separate handle or pommel. He could probably just get a wooden handle and just produce a mace head. This all depended on what materials he had. Besides the mace he needed some protection. A mace and a shield for now. The plan was made, he needed these two items as a bare minimum. If he had more time he could look into making some armor with added runes for spell casting. He was also hoping to have enough time for a few magic paddle wands. He grasped a hammer from the side and noticed that it was made from deep steel. It was better than the hammer that he was currently using back at his home. The metals he was working with here were bronze, iron, and steel. There were some steel rods here and there, but they were a bit too thin to be used as a handle. It looked like this trial wanted him to work with the thicker ingots. There were several hardy tools that he could punch holes with preset here, but first, he would need to fashion the handle. This could be done by directly molding an ingot through precision hammer blows. The next part would be the crown part. It could also be done like that, but there were other options. There were several molds here to the side. He could save some time by using one of them for the head part. Why would he do that if the end product could come out more brittle than through a regular forging method? The answer was reusability. There were many of those gates around him. He felt like this trial would have several stages where the doors opened one by one, maybe even many times. If he made a mold for the mace crown he might be able to use it again. At least the wooden part that was made for the spiky ball imprint. He chose to go with steel as it was a superior material compared to bronze and iron. With the molds here he could also try casting a sword directly from them. The problem would still be with the sharpening of it. A blunt mace with some spikes would be far easier to fashion. The hourglass was very slow, which meant that he had a lot of time, at least for now. First came the hammering of one of the heated up steel ingots. Thanks to his smithing skills being maxed out, the hammering process went rather smoothly. Roland found how the skills in this world work to be astonishing. They kept a person at a certain level of ability, whenever he picked up a hammer or a sword it all came back to him. He knew where to hit and how hard to do it depending on the item that he was working on. With time the shaft started taking shape. Next came the griff along with the handlebars that were on the top and bottom side of the mace, between the griff part. This was all done with skillful hammer hits all while the metal was nice and heated up. He had already worked on something like this before, so the motion was practiced and natural. With time he was done and could move on to the molding phase. He needed the spiked ball of the mace to fit into the shaft, and that's why he made it first. For some reason, there were various wooden objects here as well. One of them was already similar in shape to a spiked mace head. Maybe the trial was making things slightly easier for him. There were also various carving knives that were enough for him to get a proper spike shape for his next weapon. The time continued to pass. There was a lack of scribing materials here though. Roland would have to forego his spell scrolls for this test. Instead, he could make some magical wands that worked in a similar way. The problem was his mana reserves. There was a certain lack of mana stones here, so he would have to forget about lessening the strain on his MP. With time the wooden version of the spiked mace head was ready. He fitted it on the thicker weapon handle from the bottom to see if everything was in order before putting it into the mold. The smelter was heated up by him beforehand. He did it to save some time. The red-hot metal dribbled down into the prepared mold that was shut tightly. It was a similar mold case to the one he used to make his first bronze sword. While it was cooling down he went around to pick up a thick enough plate of steel. He would make a quick shield with the leftover time. This shield wouldn't need that much forming, as he could just stick to a tower shield design and would just need to rivet the handle part from the back. At the end, he would be preparing the runic structures. Without them these weapons that he made wouldn't really be cut out for much. Time was of the essence. The large hourglass above his head was a constant reminder of that. Soon he would have to face against whatever was behind those gates, and the weapons that he had time to produce wouldn't really be anything special. He could only hope that the added runic enchantments would let him squeeze out more from them. Chapter 79 Tier 2 Trial Part 2. Sparks flew with every strike of his hammer. The echoes of those hits spread through the large sealed-off arena space. With one last bash of his smithing tool, Roland was finished. The runic structure was complete and he examined it before putting it to the side. What he was working on looked to be a simple piece of steel. It wasn't much to look at, its shape was uneven and more thought was put into the handle than the rest of it. This was the last wand that Roland was able to produce. When he looked up he could see the last grains of sand finally falling. Soon the time would be up and the next stage of this test would start. He whipped the sweat of his brow while sitting down. He began gathering mana from the surroundings. There wasn't much time left, but he would use it to recover at least a bit of his mana. The whole rune crafting process made him take a hit to his mana reserves that were at about 50%. This will have to do, Roland thought while meditating in a lotus position. He could feel the abundant mana in this strange virtual space entering his body. The concentration was much higher than what he was used to in the real world. With it being this plentiful he could hope to regain his mana pool past the 70% mark in a few minutes. He was limited in what he could make in this short amount of time. The mace was to his side. It looked crude but it would have to do. He wedged the casted spiky head part on the shaft for a tight fit. There was even a spare for the head part in one of the molds that he didn't open yet. The runic structure he went with was the strengthening rune. He feared that this weapon would break easily if he just left it like this. The next item was for defense, a tower shield with a handle made from leather on the other side. He used some strength to bend it slightly for it not to be just a flat sheet of metal. It could barely pass off for a shield. The part where his hand went into wasn't reinforced too well. He riveted in another piece of steel to add to the thickness on the inside, but that was it. There was a mana shield rune inscribed on it as well. The rest of his time was spent on creating disposable wands. Those didn't take much time to make, as he only needed to make them large enough to hold the runic structure. He placed common grade attack spells on them while he used the lesser versions on his shield and mace. The wands were disposable, but he needed the mace and shield to last a bit more. He had also created a simple knife. It was also made by hammering a piece of steel into the correct shape, then sharpened to get a workable edge. He couldn't really call it a weapon much, but it would have to do as a last line of defense. He went with the sharpness rune. If he needed to cut a throat it would do. Soon the sand ran out and Roland could feel the arena rumbling once more. He was sitting in the middle of the workshop part, so he felt it moving violently. The whole thing was moving down into the hole that it came from. He quickly grabbed all the gear and started tossing it down from the platform. Luckily for him, the whole hole that the platform was going down suffered from the invisible wall syndrome. Even if he wanted to go down he wasn't able to, as it started pushing him out along with the items that he made. He was left in the arena with no workshop to speak of. He grabbed his mace and shield and placed the wands on his belt. He had made it with some leather and just tied it around his waist. There wasn't really enough time to make a belt buckle. While he was working, the scratching on one of those wooden gates got increasingly louder. Now that the timer had run out, the noise was at an all-time high. He looked to the door that the noise was coming from and first just prepared a regular spell. Source of all magic, heed my call. He used his voice to say the incantation. A bolt of energy appeared at the tip of his finger that he pointed towards the wooden gate that was now opening. He could see a couple of clawed hands coming out of there. The monsters in there were quite eager to show themselves. Mana bolt. Soon one of them couldn't wait and shoved its head through the narrow opening while the gate was still going up. This part of its body promptly exploded into chunks of meat and black blood. This wasn't quite over as Roland used the slow opening gate to his advantage. He was already at the other side of the arena, so before any of these enemies got to him he would be able to snipe some of them down. Mana bolt. Goohh. A high-pitched scream was heard after another monster fell, but this would be the last easy target that he got to slay. Soon the monsters revealed their ugly faces and lanky bodies. They were small fiends with leathery bat wings, a barbed tail, and sharp, twisted horns right above their eyes. Their size was about the same as a goblin's and the wings were small, not really meant for flight. This variant had rather pale skin, almost making them look white. Pale Imp L30. It was the creature called Imp. This was one of the monsters that was linked to the evil demon monsters. They all would start out as those small evil-looking creatures, but with time they could transform into giant muscular beings that liked nothing more than to cause pain and suffering. There were quite some of them in that room. All of them quickly spotted the spell-swinging man. Without any rhyme or reason, they charged forward, with them now being aware of his presence. Landing a hit on them with his mana bolt spell and slow casting time was hard. Soon they were upon him. He clutched his mace hard and delivered a swift blow to one of the monster's heads. His weapon produced a dim blue glow as he activated the runic structure. One hit and another of the monsters was down on the ground. They were comparatively low-level monsters to him, so he was managing. His footwork had improved after spending a year down in the dungeons. There were actually warrior skills that could be learned, but regretfully he didn't have a class that could get any of them. With some perseverance he improved still. It might not have had the backing of any special skills, but his combat sense did improve tremendously. Roland was sure to move. The arena was large enough for him to use his long legs. Even with his low agility, he could run faster than these monsters. The trick was to not fight them all at once. It was easier to fight one-on-one 20 times than one large battle against 20 opponents at once. The monsters ran after him, but they found it troublesome to get near. When they got in range they suffered a bash from the mace or a spell to the face. These small critters weren't a match for Roland even when outnumbering him by a large number. As time passed there weren't many of them left. It was clear that these monsters weren't very intelligent. There were no tactics, just rage-filled charges, mostly with their heads out while trying to aim for a bite. No experience points were getting gained from the kills, but soon he had managed to slay the last one. He activated some of the wands with the lesser mana arrow and mana bolt spells while running away. Due to how easy it was to tell where the monsters would go next, each spell was a sure hit kill. With time the last monster's head exploded and its pale leathery corpse was down on the ground in a pool of black blood. Roland leaned up against the wall while wiping some sweat from his brow. All of this running had tired him out, but thanks to his high endurance stat he gained after switching to the runic blacksmith class, he was fine. There were about 30 dead bodies on the ground, and the moment the last one fell, the arena started to rumble. The large gate door started closing back up, and the workshop in the middle had risen as well. The hourglass above him had been reset, and the sounds of scratching were now coming from 2 of those doors. I guess sleeping and resting isn't getting accounted for in this test. He looked at his mace that was still in working condition. The things that suffered more were the magical wands that he used up the charges off. They were far easier to fix, but he was slowly running dry on mana. Replenishing it would be the first thing he would do. Roland sat down while huffing. He looked at the dead monster cadavers. He expected them to vanish from this area after he killed the enemies. This whole thing felt like an illusion or a virtual game. He thought that they would just go away without a trace and reinforce his claim. But there they remained in place, just dead. What if I? Suddenly he thought of something. Before finishing up with his mana replenishing exercise, he moved over to one of the imp corpses. He pulled out his previously created knife and turned the monster over. He used the knife on the back. Soon a square-shaped piece of leathery skin was removed. Blood was dripping everywhere. The blood wasn't going to be wasted either, as he was sure to bottle some of that black liquid. If my assumptions are correct, this should work with an evolved imp monster. He could feel a faint trace of mana coming from the dead monster's blood. It was similar to a certain resource that he used for all these years. It was the magic ink he used to make his spell scrolls. Roland didn't have time to process this monster skin. He would need to use the freshly cut out lump. A pointed piece of wood was used instead of a quill. He wasn't working at optimal conditions, but he had done this many times before. In less than 10 minutes he had a working runic structure with a spell. He checked it over a couple of times before moving his hand to the skin flap. After the mana injection, he could see the runic structures light up in orange light. The process wasn't as fast as with the regular scrolls and magic ink that he was used to, but it worked. A bolt of energy flew out from this hastily produced runic scroll. Roland looked at the magic energy colliding with the wall and quickly sizzling out. This skin and imp blood wasn't optimal for this, and there was a certain decrease in power. Still, now he had another option to go with. He wasn't sure if this was done on purpose by this trial, but he would be sure to use his scribing skills to their maximum. The mace and shield that he created only needed minor repairs. He also was planning to create a backup with the previously molded spiky head. His hands started getting drenched in the pale imp's blood. This was a lesser magical being, so their blood had magical properties. Luckily these ones didn't quite have any long-range skills that could contend with his own runic magic. There was even more work for him to do. The timer was the same as last time, so Roland knew what he could or couldn't do. The fleshy runic scrolls wouldn't be made as a means of attacking, more as a means of distraction. He had to spread his mana quite thin, but with his large pool, he was managing. With time the hourglass emptied itself out. Even though Roland had spent so much time here without sleeping, he didn't feel tired. He attributed this to being some kind of world frozen in time and with different sets of rules. The strain on his body might have not been there, but this didn't mean that he wasn't getting psychologically tired from overthinking everything. With a resounding screech, another set of white-looking imps flung themselves out of the gate. Their level had increased by 5 and there was a similar number. This group found themselves stepping into something oily. There was a large pool of grease right outside the gate, and Roland was just waiting for it to open up. The monsters weren't very smart, so they charged towards him, but they soon found themselves inside of a grease fire. There was a common spell to create a puddle of grease on the ground. With an addition of some flames it would create a combination called the grease fire. This one burned a lot hotter and could not be doused by water either. Those pale imps were more susceptible to fire more than regular imps, so he used that knowledge to his advantage. While they were burning up, Roland used this chance to snipe them from afar. The burning imps weren't the only problem now, as the second gate had opened as well. Lesser Spiked Devil L40. These new monsters were green in coloration and slightly taller than the imps. There were many spikes coming out of their bodies. if you looked closely you could spot some strange green liquid escaping from those spikes. These guys looked like trouble, but there were far fewer of them than of the other group. They looked to also be more resistant to the grease flames that were activated in front of the gate they were coming from. Another game of cat and mouse ensued. Roland was trying to keep the enemies at a distance as that was where he had the advantage. At least that was true before some of those new spiky monsters started somehow ejecting those thorns from their body. He quickly defended himself with his shield while returning fire with one of his wands. He was sure to activate his mana shield this time around. Those spikes looked poisonous, even when getting a flesh wound he could be done for if he got hit once. Regretfully for the monsters, the grease fire that was made proved their downfall. More than half of them suffered a fiery demise through it. The rest was blasted with ranged spells. The ones that got close enough were bashed in the head with a mace. Other ones suffered explosion wounds from planted mine runes that he had prepared. All in all, he managed to survive the next wave and both of the gates were closed up again. Roland fell on his butt while looking at the many dead monsters on the ground. There were still 2 gates left. The monsters were just adding to their forces with each consecutive wave and it looked like there would be more of them coming. The middle platform appeared once more and he got his butt into gear. There were more monsters that needed skinning and more repairs to be made. The grease fire approach looked to be working, but less on the stronger monsters that were appearing. They were also mostly fiend-type monsters that gained fire immunity with their evolutions, which made his strategy look bad with the future in mind. He didn't have any holy attacks up his sleeve though. They were the bane of evil-aligned creatures like these. He would need to figure out a way to get to them with conventional magic. More scrolls were made as well as repairs for his gear. He had to replace the first mace as it shattered into pieces after colliding with a spiked devil's skull. With more time on his hands and a plan in mind, Roland was able to expand his protective capabilities. He hammered a larger sheet of metal to create a half-baked breastplate. Some wrist guards and graves with more runic enchantments to boost his defenses. There wasn't enough time to make anything difficult, so he needed to give up on getting any gauntlets to protect his hands. Soon it was time for the 3rd wave, then the 4th. If he would make it to the last one would remain to be seen. Chapter 80 Tier 2 Trial Part 3. Will this be enough? A beat-up-looking Roland was standing close to the edge of the workshop. It was still there, but soon it would slide down below the arena ground once more. The whole area was filled with monster remains that came from 3 of the 4 large gates. He looked at the newest type, that was a hellhound. These creatures were quite nimble and hard to fight off. The resistance to fire was increased even more, which made the grease fire trap that he made mostly ineffective. His body was all scratched up due to the fight with the monster hounds. He had no cloth armor to put under his armored gear. Only ordinary cloth that wouldn't protect him from the tough claws and fangs of these monsters. Roland had still managed to survive the 3rd wave of the monsters, but he was now feeling the fatigue. He couldn't use the previous plan of setting everything ablaze or making a minefield. The hellhounds were fast runners and could smell out the buried flesh scrolls. This last gate looked to have an even stronger creature behind it. The number of them decreased with each door, but their strength also increased accordingly. Roland would rather fight more of those imps that were easy to kill with his current degree of traps. With a new unknown variant of the creature, he would need to come up with a new battle plan. Lucky for him, this world that he was in wasn't entirely real. The workshop he was working with had a strange feature in it. If enough materials were removed, they would replenish themselves. He tested it out by removing some sheets of metal that were placed in one of the provided boxes. After removing all of them, another set materialized itself in the box out of nowhere. This same phenomenon happened with all the other resources, be it the metal rods or ingots. With this slight bug in place, Roland decided on his new plan. The unprocessed sheets of metal that were meant for making thinner armor pieces were distributed around the arena. When enough of them were out there, he utilized the stock rods that were also there. The ones that were used were the thinner ones that could be used as wires. Soon a spider web-like pattern composed of metallic rods appeared through the whole arena. For some reason, the hourglass was giving him more time for this last big door. Roland could try getting through this task in a less troublesome way. Creating a good set of armor and some weapons weren't out of the question in this time frame he was given. He had chosen a different approach this time around, mostly due to the fact of not being a pure fighter. With the help of a special rune wand that could discharge heat and flames, he began connecting the metallic parts together. He didn't need them to stick together that well, just enough for the runic traces to go through them. Quite a grueling process of welding and hammering took place as the work continued. The main runes of this trap were placed on the larger pieces of sheet metal, while the rods used as a means of transferring mana. Roland had never tried connecting this many runes together in one runic structure. He knew that there were risks involved and that he would be instantly drained of most of his mana after one activation. The decision was already made though, he would take care of the last part of the test with one big bang. The biggest problem would arise if the monsters coming out were resistant to the magic he would be producing. Time continued to pass him by as he worked. The more he hammered, the more he started to doubt if this would even work. Roland was afraid that the thing that he was making would just blow up instead of working. That or he would either lose all of his mana instantly and pass out, or it just wouldn't turn on. After a lot of painstaking work, he was somehow done. There were no breaks in this trial whatsoever, and he had been here for several days with no sleep. For some reason, he wasn't feeling that fatigued, but the constant thinking was slowly getting to him. He placed himself in the center of this spider web-like trap that he made. It would have to do, as the hourglass was seconds away from being emptied. The whole thing he made was covered in sand. This was done by him to not make it too obvious for the monsters. He also hoped that the monster dogs would ignore the metal parts, as there was no flesh involved. I guess this is it. Roland glanced over his creations that could very well blow up in his face. The area was still filled with his mines, and the grease fire tactic would be used as well. He heard a clicking sound and the workshop part slowly descended below the arena. The clawing of the monsters against the gate walls intensified with their movement. These demonic monsters were greeted by the usual fire treatment. These fiends didn't learn from their previous blunders, as they just charged towards his general direction the moment they were out of their locked room. Some of them fell to the flames while he stood away from the danger. He had his tower shield with him to block any incoming projectile attacks like the spikes from the demons from the second gate. The doors were opening at about the same time, which was fine for him as he needed the monster to enter the area of the trap together. Hounds that looked like they came out of hell started howling as they were finally free from their confines. Roland, on the other hand, looked at the sturdiest fourth gate, which had the surprise last monster type. There it was, about 2 meters of height and quite muscular. Its skin was crimson and disfigured. It looked like the being had been burned badly. The face had small beady black eyes with which he felt like the creature was looking at him. The most characteristic thing about this monster was its chains. It had many of those wrapped around its whole body. To its arms, a set of chains with hooks and other pointy objects was attached. They were thick, and the creature was dragging it on the ground while slowly making a trail in the arena's sand. Roland blocked a few incoming spikes while trying not to get distracted by the new enemy. There was only one of those chained demons, but it was a Tier 2 creature above the 50th level. This was a Tier 2 class change trial. Normally monsters above level 50 wouldn't appear as enemies. When they did, they would be that exact same level. This trial was a bit different, and Roland already knew that. The sheer number of these monsters already was out of the ordinary. From what he knew, even the warrior class trials weren't this enemy intensive. Apparently most of the time they would only fight one enemy at the Tier 2 level to prove themselves. Depending on the rarity of the class, the difficulty increased. He didn't think that a level 50 warrior would survive past the spiked fiends, but he had to go beyond that and face off against something well past the beginning levels of Tier 2. Kuaha. He snapped back into reality and tried to focus on the battle. The monsters exploded here and there while walking through some of the mine runes. He spent the most time preparing this metallic construction, so this time around some of the imps and spiked devils would actually get through. Not yet. It was a waiting game. The more of the monsters went into this trap, the better it would be for him. The biggest problem with that was the varying degrees of speed that all of these creatures possessed. The two first types of monsters were about the same when it came to that, but the hellhounds were much faster. The new demon that was dragging the chains was the slowest yet. It was just slowly lumbering towards him without a care in the world. This didn't bode well for Roland, as he just wanted to activate his Frankenstein of a trap before any of the monsters could reach him. In a few moments, he could hear the loud howls and gritting of teeth. One of the hellhounds was upon him and he needed to defend himself. Thus a war of attrition began. While the Tier 2 chain-slinging monster took its sweet time, Roland was continually attacked by the infernal dogs. He was someone that actually liked dogs, but here he was forced to cave their heads in with his mace. When he delivered a smashing blow to one of the creature's faces, its teeth flew in all directions. This didn't keep from another one from biting his leg, its teeth infused with magical fire. The greaves that he fashioned beforehand managed to somehow protect his leg. With a quick smack of a mace to the monster dog's side, it was flung away into the distance. While being busy with defending himself from the more agile monsters, a spike coming from another one made its way through a gap in his armor. He winced in pain while putting up his shield and defending himself from any other incoming projectiles. The only thing he could do now was to move back, circling around the trap area he made while biding his time. But there was a small problem: the more he circled around, the more he found himself getting surrounded. Soon the spiked devils and even the imps were moving in for the kill. He was now mostly just pushing them back with his shield while not being able to use his mace. If he did a large swing, he worried that one of the many monsters would deliver a killing blow. Now or never. Finally, the largest of the monsters had gotten in range. This prompted Roland to bolt back to the spot where the control rune was. He found himself tossing his shield away while inserting the shaft of his mace into a hellhound's mouth before finally placing his hand on it. The control rune was engraved on a thick piece of metal. From it, many various rods of steel were sticking out while hidden under a thin layer of dirt. After placing his palm on this rune, he injected his mana into it. The moment he did, he felt like his head would explode. It was as if someone was pushing a giant nail through his ear, right towards his brain. Arg! A flash of electricity ran through the entire runic trap that he created as everything lit up like a Christmas tree. After working for a year with generators and electricity, he had learned a thing or two about those runes. This trap produced a massive electrical shock that was discharged into the monsters. All of them got hit while Roland curled up in a small area where the lesser lightning runes that he made wouldn't jolt him into the afterlife. He didn't come out unscathed, as the drain on his mana was immense. This was clearly shown by a bloody nose along with more blood coming out of his ears. The whole place went silent. All of the monsters laid dead on the ground after receiving the massive shock. Roland wasn't in a much better state though. He started wincing while trying to push himself off the ground. He felt terrible, but he was alive. My head, did I get them all? After a moment of silence, he got his answer in the form of rattling chains. He moved his head up and his eyes started to focus on the menacing sound. There it was, the Tier 2 monster. It was still alive, inching towards him while the chains shook about. Its skin looked even more charged than before, and it was even smoking. Fuck! Roland felt sick. Due to using this jerry-rigged trap, his mana had dropped below 5%. It was a miracle that he was even conscious. This demon or devil wouldn't give him much time to get back to his feet though. It just slowly tricked towards him with slow large strides. It took him a moment to find the mace that he inserted into a monster's mouth along with his shield. With weak shaky steps, he moved towards it and managed to get to them before this monster got to him. Roland pumped himself up. The monster couldn't be at full health either. It received the hit from the trap, but it was at the outer part of it. Because of this, it probably received less of a shock than the rest of the monsters that were now dead. This came to light in the coming exchange that these two remaining warriors had. The monster gave out a deep groaning roar before swinging its hand toward Roland. He defended himself with his shield that buckled under the pressure. Those chains rattled around as the chain devil attempted another strike. The monster was quite sluggish and its hits were quite easy to read. The hits were quite real though, as each time those massive chained fists descended onto Roland's shield he felt his bones rattling. His hand that was holding onto the shield had gone numb a long time ago. But this was the last enemy, and if he failed now, he would need to do the whole thing again. He gathered all of his strength that he had left and took another blow to the shield. It received another dent but somehow remained intact. This time around he didn't let the monster take its time to wind up again, no, instead he swung his mace towards its knee. He injected the remaining mana that he had into this mace and delivered a crushing blow with all of his strength. This part of the leg didn't have any chains wrapped around it. He heard a nice cracking sound of the creature's bone. Soon it lost its footing and tumbled forward, allowing Roland the chance that he was aiming for. The shield was tossed to the side as he grasped the mace with both his hands. With a long overhead strike, he brought down the spiked ball on the back of the creature's head. He started hitting it, over and over again. His maddened shouts filled the silent arena and echoed throughout it. Die, die, die. The creature's head that had a somewhat humanoid shape soon turned into a caved-in mess of flesh and bone. The spiked ball that was on the mace shattered into many chunks of metal while Roland continued. Even after that, he continued to hit it with what was left of the mace's shaft. Only after some time he managed to snap out of his rage-filled stupor. He groaned while falling to the side into some monster remains. The only thing he was capable of doing now was panting and wheezing. The only thing that kept him awake were the sounds of the large arena gates closing themselves back again. He dreaded the thought that this might not have been the end to this trial. If another monster showed up now, then he would need to give up. But instead of that, something else happened. The walls started to shift again and the closed gates through which the monsters were coming out from started moving below ground. Though it weren't the gates that were moving, it was the ceiling. Roland rolled over onto his back and could see the top of the arena opening. From it a flight of stairs descended along with the ceiling. Soon the rumble ceased, and he was left with a way up. It seemed that this might have not been the end of this trial quite yet. What now? Before he could ask himself if he would need to fight another monster when he climbed those stairs, he felt a strange feeling wash over his whole body. The injuries that he had sustained were being healed and the cloudiness over his mind was being washed away. In a matter of seconds, he was fine, a full recovery was achieved. He hopped up to his feet and also noticed that the monster bodies had long vanished along with any signs of combat. What remained were the stairs up. He was even back to wearing the generic clothes that he had before fashioning himself better armor. Roland narrowed his eyes at the flight of stairs. There was nothing here anymore even after moving around those stairs and what remained of this arena. The only thing he could do was to move up. If there was some kind of bonus boss, there was something that he feared. So he climbed, and to his surprise the area that he found himself wasn't fit for battle. No, it was a library. There he saw one large desk with some books on it and a magic candle lighting the way. After making sure that there weren't any hidden enemies around, he moved forward. His hand went to the first book he could find. Secrets of Rune Smithing. After flipping through the pages of this book and picking out another one, he figured out what this was. I guess this is the part that I receive my runesmith lord skills. Roland looked at the pile of books here. There were quite a lot of them and it looked like they would offer him more than just skills. There were designs for certain runes, theories that couldn't be bought at auction houses. With this he might be able to clear up the deficiencies in his knowledge. It was time to read. Is this going to be a written exam?